Hi, everybody. Tonight, I'd like to take you on a journey, a slow, deliberate unfolding of a world that once was. A world filled with whispers of honor, of ritualized violence, and of thunderous silence between sword strikes. We're going to step gently into the realm of medieval duels, but not the flashing, fantastical ones you may have seen in movies. No, this will be a quieter story. A story about what a real medieval duel truly looked like. Slow, heavy, methodical, and drenched in the meaning of every swing, every breath, every glance beneath a visor. This story will unfold across 24 parts, each a new chapter, each building upon the last like layers of tempered steel. We'll meet knights and squires. We'll trace trembling parchment signed with royal seals. We'll sit among silent judges in cloaks heavy with fur. And we'll feel the weight, not just of steel, but of reputation, pride, and the slow creep of fear. A duel was not simply a fight. It was a ceremony, a gamble, a calling. So tuck yourself in, let your thoughts grow soft, and come with me now into part one. The wind was not fierce that morning. It arrived like an old friend, cool and reserved, curling through the narrow streets of the town of Baugé in the year of our Lord 1389. Smoke from the hearts of cottages twisted gently into the dawn air. Bells rang in the distance, slow, not yet the urgent peals of alarm or celebration. A kind of stillness cloaked the land, one that clung to the earth like dew. In the great square of the town, the platform had already been raised. Built from timber dark with the cold sweat of morning, its boards were grooved from the iron studs of boots that had paced here before. This was not the first duel the platform had seen, nor would it be the last. 4 posts at its corners bore black banners, each stitched with silver thread in the shape of a downward pointing sword, a symbol of judgment. Judgment, not rage. Judgment, not vengeance. That was the language of this duel. Behind the platform, rows of benches had been arranged in a rising semicircle. For the nobles, cloth draped each one, deep blues, reds, even one in the pure white of the duke's household. The commoners would stand behind the ropes, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath making clouds in the morning chill. Already, the murmurs had begun. Someone had seen one of the duelists arrive before dawn. Someone else swore they'd heard a priest chanting psalms behind the inn. At the very edge of the field, a scribe dipped a stiff quill into ink the color of midnight. He was not writing yet. He was listening to names whispered, titles confirmed, oaths exchanged behind the veils of tents. 2 men would fight this day, but in truth, more than 2 hearts would bleed. Inside one of the cloth tents, a knight stood still, staring at the wooden crossbeam above his head. His armor gleamed dimly, not polished for beauty, but for readiness. Each plate was strapped by hand, buckled with leather softened from years of sweat. His name was Sir Alaric of Montroi. A man neither young nor yet aged, he bore the scars of war on his hands and a deeper one beneath his left eye, an old wound, the origin of which he did not speak about. He had not slept. Not from fear. Fear was the companion of all who fought with purpose. No, it was not fear that had robbed him of sleep, but memory. Memory of the accusation. Memory of the letter sent to the Duke's court declaring his dishonor. Memory of the name he had been called. A liar, a coward, a murderer. The words had burned hotter than any forge. His opponent, they said, was younger, a man of noble blood but untested steel, Lord Immersive de Vere. Alaric had seen him only once at the pre-duel hearing. Slender but not slight, with eyes like chilled water. He'd spoken little, his voice carried by a steward, but his gaze had rested upon Alaric with an unwavering calm that spoke of conviction, or something like it. Alaric breathed deeply now. The scent of oil and leather filled his nose. His squire Thomas, barely 17, stood beside him, silent, hands trembling slightly as he checked the arm buckles one last time. "My lord," Thomas whispered, "the hour is close." Alaric nodded. No grand speech passed his lips, just a gentle touch to the boy's shoulder. Then, a nod. Outside, the herald was stepping up to the platform, parchment in hand, voice rising like a drumbeat. In accordance with the traditions upheld by the House of Rouvray, and under the watch of His Grace, the Duke of Angiers, let it be known, Sir Alaric of Montroi and Lord Immersive de Vere shall now meet in single combat. Their grievance laid bare before the Almighty, and this company, let the sword speak where words fail. The crowd murmured. Somewhere, a child whispered something about knights and dragons. A mother hushed her. From the other side of the field, another tent opened. Emeric stepped forth. His armor was newer, the steel less scuffed, the crest upon his chest plate more vivid. A golden falcon in mid-descent. His helm hung from one hand. His hair was tied back, the color of dark honey, and his expression unreadable. A second squire trailed him, smaller even than Thomas, holding Eric's shield carefully upright. Both men reached the platform. Each climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, the wood creaking beneath their armored weight. They did not look at the crowd. They did not glance at the nobles watching from velvet-draped benches. They faced only each other. The arbiter stepped between them, an elderly man in robes of unadorned wool. His face, though lined with age, was sharp, eyes that had watched 40 duels and forgotten none. He raised his hand. "Do you come willingly?" he asked. "I do," said Alaric. "I do," said Emeric. "Do you accept the judgment of the sword?" "I do. I do." "Then raise your blades." The crowd held its breath. The birds, usually noisy in the early morning, seemed to hush. Even the wind paused. Steel rose, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time the duel truly began, not with a strike, but with the echo of silence. The silence lingered. For a moment it seemed that time itself had grown hesitant, as if the world around the two duelists were waiting for permission to move again. Neither man shifted. Their swords, though raised, remained still in the pale light. The weight of the moment was heavy, not in volume, but in gravity. A tension that held the entire crowd captive. Alaric's fingers flexed slightly around the grip of his sword. He felt the familiar texture of the leather wrapping, worn just enough to feel like part of his own hand. Every part of his body was alert, not in the way of panic, but readiness. Measured readiness. He did not blink. Across from him, Emeric stood poised, sword held high and shield close. His feet were spaced precisely, and though his chest rose and fell with breath, his stance was practiced. There was no sign of nervous fidgeting, no darting glance toward the crowd, no shift of weight that betrayed discomfort. But still, Alaric could feel the youth in him. The confidence that comes before life has carved its reminders into one's body. The arbiter stepped back slowly, raising one arm to signal readiness. A narrow strip of white cloth slipped from his sleeve as he lifted it, some old habit or relic of his office, and with a sharp downward flick, the signal was given. The duel had begun, but neither man lunged. Not yet. Duels like these were not the clashing frenzies of bards, tales, or popular memory. They were cautious, deliberate dances where the cost of one misstep could not be measured merely in points or bruises, but in honor, in legacy, in life. Alaric took the first step, a measured pace forward, his shield angled to his left, sword held in a guard across his chest. Emeric matched the motion, his sword lowering slightly, his weight shifting to his back foot in response. They began to circle. The creak of armor was faint but distinct. Plate rubbing against plate, leather pulling taut. The hush of the crowd deepened. From time to time, a horse in the distance would snort, or the wind would move a flap of canvas, but none of it interrupted the spell being cast on the field. Alaric feinted, just the faintest twitch of his sword, and watched Emeric's reaction. The younger man flinched, but only slightly, drawing back his shield and adjusting his grip. The knight noted this. Still too eager, still too green. He could work with that. But Emeric was quick, faster than expected. When Alaric stepped in with a low jab, Emeric parried with the flat of his blade and countered with a swift diagonal cut aimed at Alaric's shoulder. The older knight twisted his torso, letting the blade glance off his pauldron, and stepped back out of range. A few gasps from the crowd. Back into the circle they moved. Alaric's mind remained calm. He did not allow adrenaline to flood him. That was for those who relied on strength and impulse. He relied on patience, on the discipline of years, on knowing that the first strike rarely ended a duel. It was the second, or the third, or the one that came after a pause when your opponent thought you had grown tired. They clashed again. This time, Emeric advanced with a series of high cuts, his blade a blur as it glanced off Alaric's shield once, twice, 3 times. The sound of steel on steel rang out like church bells. Alaric gave ground, not from retreat but calculation, and then suddenly stepped in with a heavy overhead blow. Emeric caught it on his shield, but the force sent him staggering half a step backward. The audience murmured louder now. A woman in the third row gripped her shawl tighter. A nobleman whispered something to the lady beside him, eyes fixed on the platform. Emeric steadied himself and lifted his sword again. His breathing had quickened. A flush of color rose in his cheeks. Alaric could see it, the rising flame of frustration. The boy had expected a more direct duel, something cleaner perhaps, but that was the danger of youth, expecting fairness from ritualized violence. They circled again. This time it was Emeric who fainted, and Alaric who did not fall for it. The older knight stepped wide and swept his sword low. Emeric barely raised his leg in time to avoid the cut and stumbled to his left. A small misstep, but one that mattered. Alaric didn't pursue. He waited. He let the stumble settle in Emeric's body, in his mind. He let the knowledge of vulnerability echo in his opponent's thoughts. And only when the boy regained his footing and came forward again did Alaric respond, this time with a sudden jab to the ribs. It struck plate, not flesh, but the impact was real. Emeric hissed and stumbled again, falling back 2 steps. The arbiter said nothing. He would only speak when the rules were broken. Pain was not against the rules, nor was humiliation. A trickle of blood began to appear just above Emeric's gauntlet, where a strap had come loose or a seam had been weak. It was not much, but blood is a kind of language on the field. It says, "You are mortal." It says, "This is not a game." Alaric remained still watching. Emeric raised his blade again, slower this time. His face was still calm, but the tremble in his left leg told a different story. He was beginning to understand. This was not the duel of song or story. This was attrition. This was exposure. And still, they danced. Back and forth, striking guard, retreat and advance. Time passed, but not quickly. The minutes felt like hours. Sweat began to dampen the cloth beneath their armor. Breaths grew louder, harsher. They struck less now, not from weakness, but because each movement had to matter. They were learning each other's rhythms, seeing the thoughts behind the eyes. Then, a clang of blades locked them together, chest to chest, helmets nearly touching. Emeric growled, low and fierce, and tried to shove Alaric backward. The older knight held firm, grounding himself like a stone in the earth, and leaned forward. "You still want this, boy?" he whispered through the visor slits. Emeric didn't answer. He pushed harder. Alaric shifted his feet, twisted slightly, and broke the lock, stepping back as he did. Emeric staggered forward from the release of pressure, and in that instant, Alaric struck again. A quick downward sweep across the thigh. Armor held, barely. The boy cried out, not in agony but frustration, and stepped back once more. They stood apart again, panting. In the noble stand, someone began to applaud. A single clap. Then another joined. It did not spread, but it was enough. Enough to remind both men that they were being watched. Judged. Not just for skill, but for something deeper. Alaric stared across the space between them. He saw not a noble now, not a boy. He saw a man who would not quit, who did not know how. And that, more than anything else, made this duel far from over. The platform beneath them bore the quiet witness of every blow. Its timbers groaning softly under the weight of the armored men above. Dust, disturbed by heavy footsteps, and the brush of boots, hovered in the still morning air, glittering faintly in the weak sunlight. They were both breathing hard now. Alaric could feel the warm moisture gathering in the crook of his back beneath his armor, trickling down like slow rain. Each breath passed through clenched teeth, drawn with effort and steadied by habit. His shield arm ached, not from injury, but from the relentless pressure of keeping it raised, absorbing each of Emeric's youthful, sharp strikes. Emeric had retreated to the far edge of the circle. He stood tall, but his shoulders had dipped just slightly, as if the realization of the duel's length had begun to settle into his limbs. His right gauntlet twitched twice, likely adjusting his grip, and his chest heaved under his breastplate. Between them, the space yawned wider than it looked. It was a space filled with decision, with calculation, with a dozen imagined possibilities that might unfold in a single step forward, each one ending differently. Neither moved. A crow called somewhere in the distance. It sounded out of place, too wild, too alive in a moment that had become so still. Emeric broke the silence first. A short, deliberate step forward followed by another. His sword was angled low, just above his thigh, and his shield tucked inward, hiding much of his chest. It was a defensive approach, not an aggressive one. Alaric narrowed his eyes. The boy was learning. The older knight pivoted on his back foot and moved to the left in a wide arc. The way a wolf circles a fire, respectful but curious. Emmerich mirrored the motion, his own arc closing in. For a few seconds they moved like dancers beneath an invisible roof, steps perfectly timed, eyes locked through steel. Then they clashed again. The impact this time was sharp, echoing, and immediate. Emmerich led with a high diagonal slash meant to draw Alaric's shield upward, but the veteran read it clearly. He blocked with a slight angle, letting the blow slide across the metal, then immediately returned with a thrust toward Emmerich's abdomen. Emmerich twisted, just barely avoiding the point, and brought the edge of his shield around to bash at Alaric's shoulder. The blow connected. Not cleanly, but enough to jolt the older man off balance. It was a bold move. Alaric stumbled a half step, regaining posture with a low grunt. His sword dipped, then rose in a quick arc as Emmerich tried to press the advantage. Their blades met again, clashing so close to their faces that sparks hissed against their visors. A collective breath was drawn from the crowd. They separated once more. This time, it was Emmerich who had drawn blood. Not from a wound inflicted by the sword, but from that shield bash, a thin red line across Alaric's jaw, just beneath the edge of his helmet. A shallow cut. But again, blood spoke, and Alaric listened. He did not grow angry. That was never his way. But something within him, something old, something slow and deep, began to shift. Not rage, not pride. Focus. The kind of focus that sharpened edges in the mind more keenly than a whetstone could blades. He advanced. No longer waiting, no longer measuring the boy's footwork. Alaric surged forward, not recklessly, but with command. His sword came down in a powerful arc, smashing into Emmerich's shield with such force that the younger man dropped to one knee, barely catching himself with his offhand. The crowd gasped. Some leaned forward, others drew back. Emmerich rose quickly, shield raised again, sword swinging in a low arc to deter pursuit. But Alaric didn't need to chase. He knew what he had planted. Doubt. The kind that nestles in the joints, how in the wrists, in the space between thoughts. Doubt is a heavier weight than armor. The duel slowed again. This was not an unfamiliar rhythm for Alaric. Many duels began in fire and cooled into something colder, more deliberate. Emmerich, however, was showing the wear of unfamiliar ground. His stances were slower now, still disciplined, still trained, but no longer crisp. A man who had studied combat, but had not lived long inside it. They circled once more, swords low, eyes higher, and then something subtle. Alaric saw it. Emmerich's right leg slightly too wide, his weight uneven. A tell, a whisper, a message from the body that the mind had not meant to send. Alaric feinted to the left, drawing the younger man's attention, and then pivoted right, stepping inside the arc of Emmerich's sword and driving his shield forward like a ram. The blow landed in Emmerich's chest with a metallic thud. He flew backward, not far, but enough. Enough to crash to the floor of the platform with a heavy grunt, his sword skidding across the board several feet away. Time stilled again. 100 eyes watched, unblinking. Emmerich coughed, breathless, as he scrambled to his knees, reaching for his fallen blade. Alaric did not press. He did not strike. He waited. Somewhere in the noble's stand, someone stood, perhaps to cry foul, perhaps in anticipation, but the arbiter held up one hand, still within the rules. No intervention. Emmerich's fingers closed around his hilt. He rose. His breath now came in audible gusts, his stance wide but uncertain. He raised his blade once more, though the tip trembled ever so slightly. And then for the first time, Alaric spoke. "You're not ready for this," he said softly, voice muffled through the visor. Emmerich did not respond, but his eyes burned. There was silence, and then the duel continued. The platform had become a world unto itself. Outside, the sun had crept higher, its rays brushing the banners that framed the duel, casting long slashes of gold across the planks. Shadows of blades and bodies flickered across the wooden surface like memories, faint, fleeting, shaped by the steel and sweat of two men bound not by hatred, but by something heavier. Expectation. Emmerich stood upright once more, though the defiance in his stance was beginning to war with fatigue. His armor was no longer immaculate. Dirt smeared the edges of his greaves, and one strap across his left shoulder hung just loose enough to suggest discomfort. The shield on his arm was scuffed now, bearing the proof of each impact like a ledger of lessons learned too fast. Alaric, for his part, had not pressed the advantage. He had struck, yes. He had moved with intention. But now, once more, he stood still, breathing slowly, waiting. It was not a taunt, not some cruel display of dominance. It was something older, a choice rooted in understanding. Alaric had fought men before, dozens of them, some better armed, some stronger, some even faster. But he knew the patterns. He knew when the rhythm of a duel began to echo its own ending. And yet, something in Emeric resisted that rhythm. The boy, no, not a boy, not anymore, stepped forward again. The crowd shifted. A low ripple passed through the rows. A few murmurs of disbelief, whispers. He's still fighting. He's still standing. Emeric struck first. His blade moved in a tight arc, a textbook downward diagonal, and Alaric met it with the flat of his own. The sound of steel clashing sang out, and again the two men were close. Very close. Breath close. Emeric shoved with his shield, an echo of what Alaric had done to him only minutes earlier. It lacked the same weight, but it was quick, unexpected. It bought him a heartbeat of space, enough to pivot, to twist, to bring his sword upward in a risky uppercut stroke aimed for Alaric's side. Alaric turned, caught the blow on his hip plate, and retaliated with a downward hammer of his pommel into Emeric's shoulder. A blunt strike. The kind not meant to cut, but to stagger, and it did. Emeric gasped, not in pain, but from the sudden shock of breathlessness, and backed away, his shield arm dropping momentarily. Alaric watched as the young man took another breath, watched as he raised his shield again, and then watched something change. There, in Emeric's eyes, a glint, not of pride, not of triumph, of desperation. It was not the flailing kind, not wild. It was something sharper, desperation focused into a single narrow beam, the kind that drives a man not away from danger, but into it. Alaric exhaled slowly. He recognized it. He had seen it once before, years ago, in a campaign beyond the northern forests. A young foot soldier, pinned and cornered by two mercenaries, had turned and charged into them, not for victory, but because there was nothing else left. The charge hadn't saved him, but it had given him something else, dignity. Emeric moved. This time, there was no feint, no circle, no pretense of defense. He came straight at Alaric, shield braced, sword pulled back in a tight arc like an arrow straining against the bowstring. The older knight adjusted, stepping slightly to his right, reading the angle, anticipating the strike. But Emeric didn't swing. Instead, he dropped his sword. Not completely. He let it fall forward, then caught it in his other hand, now swinging it in a low sweep from the left, a reversal. Alaric caught it just in time with the edge of his own blade, steel screaming as it skidded sideways. The maneuver was clever, risky, and had it been timed just a breath faster, it might have landed. Might have. Alaric responded with a swift, punishing blow to Emeric's upper arm. A cut, not deep, but enough. The younger man recoiled, grimacing as blood began to soak the padding beneath his plate. The audience, once passive, now leaned forward with intent. Some winced. A noblewoman placed a gloved hand to her mouth. An older man in furs whispered to his companion, words too faint to hear but filled with judgment. Still, Emeric did not retreat. Even wounded, he came forward again, his stance looser now, less refined. His swings were broad, his shield raised more out of instinct than precision. Alaric blocked, parried, let the flurry pass like a storm. He did not strike back immediately. He waited until the movements began to slow, until Emeric's shoulders drooped just slightly, until the sword dipped after each cut, lagging behind the intent. Then Alaric moved, a quick step forward, a bash with the shield that knocked Emeric sideways, a swift twist of the wrist that brought Alaric's blade hilt first into Emeric's chest plate, pushing him off balance. Then a sweep of the leg. Emeric fell, not violently, not disgracefully, but with the exhaustion of a man who has given more than he thought he had. His sword skittered away again, and this time he did not reach for it. He lay there, one hand braced against the wooden floor, the other pressed to his bleeding arm. His head tilted upward, visor open, eyes meeting Alaric's. There was no shame in them, only stillness, a stillness that Alaric recognized, the kind that came not from giving up, but from knowing the limit had been reached. The arbiter stepped forward, silent until now. His voice rang clear across the field, ancient and formal. Lord Emeric de Vere, do you yield? A long pause. The younger man's lips parted, a breath, a flicker of hesitation, and then softly he said, I yield. The words were not broken. They were not bitter. They were final. A collective exhale passed through the crowd. Relief, disappointment, respect, all mingled in that sound. Alaric lowered his blade, not with triumph, but with reverence. The duel had ended, but the story was only just beginning. The moment of silence that followed Emmeric's yielding was not one of celebration, but of reverence. There were no cheers, no triumphant cries, just a hush, deep and weighty, as if even the wind dared not speak too soon. The crowd remained still, eyes fixated on the platform, as if the wood itself had become sacred ground. Alaric stood above Emmeric, his chest rising and falling with deliberate breaths, his sword lowered to his side, the tip grazing the platform's boards. The steel was dark with dust and blood, not enough to alarm, but enough to mark the reality of the contest. His shield arm ached dully, but he paid it no mind. He watched Emeric, not as a defeated enemy, but as a man who had stood and fought and yielded with dignity intact. The arbiter stepped forward again, his robe catching in the breeze. His face remained unreadable as if carved from wood. He raised his hand and the moment crystallized. "Let it be recorded," he said, voice solemn and clear, "that in the presence of the noble court of Angiers, and under the watching eyes of his grace, the Duke's representative, a trial of arms was conducted between Sir Alaric of Montrois and Lord Emeric de Vere." He paused. The scribe near the corner of the field dipped his quill into ink and began to write, the soft scratching of parchment almost lost beneath the words. Lord Emeric, having withstood honorable combat and upon reaching his limit, yielded his claim, thus relinquishing his accusation. Sir Alaric stands uncondemned. There it was, the words that mattered more than steel. Uncondemned, not innocent, not victorious in the courtly sense, but cleared, freed of stain. The duel had not proven a truth. It had proven worthiness to stand above accusation. That was all the sword could do. Two attendants came forward from Emmeric's side of the field. One carried a small satchel, the other a length of linen already stained with tincture. They approached slowly, with the cautious reverence afforded to one who had faced death and survived. Emmeric, though pale, lifted himself with their help, and did not flinch when the cloth was wrapped around his arm. Alaric turned then, and only then, and stepped away. His squire Thomas had rushed forward before he reached the edge. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide, but he carried himself with purpose. "My lord," Thomas said, voice trembling only slightly, "shall I? Should I take your blade?" Alaric nodded. He handed the sword over with care, as one might offer a torch still burning at the end of a long night. Thomas took it, eyes scanning his knight's form for injury, his small hands twitching with the urge to adjust straps or check buckles, but Alaric placed a hand on his shoulder. "No need," he said quietly. "It's done." The two of them stepped down from the platform. As they did, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd, quiet, respectful, yet filled with energy. A woman whispered, "He didn't kill him." A man beside her said, "He could have." Another voice, older, remarked, "He spared him. That's what mattered." Behind them, Emeric was now seated on the edge of the platform, breathing steadily, eyes fixed not on his wound, but on Alaric's back as the knight walked away. He did not hate him. He did not love him either. But there was something like understanding there. A quiet acknowledgement. A lesson learned not from books or tutors, but from the weight of steel and silence. Back in the private tent, Alaric removed his gauntlets one by one. Each release of leather straps felt like peeling away another layer of tension. The weight of the duel had not truly lifted yet. That would come later, perhaps tonight, perhaps not for days. Thomas set the sword aside and knelt to begin loosening the greaves. "Will they believe it now?" the boy asked, voice cautious. Alaric didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, looking down at his hands, calloused, nicked, dirtied anew. "They'll believe," he said finally, "because they saw." But it wasn't a confession. He didn't say he lied. "He didn't need to," Alaric replied, gaze still distant. "He fought with everything he had. He tried, and then he yielded. That speaks louder than words." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Do you forgive him?" That made Alaric turn his head, not sharply, but slowly. He met the boy's gaze, and for the first time since morning, there was a softness in his eyes. "There's nothing to forgive," he said. He did what he thought was right. He stood by his accusation, and when the sword judged him, he accepted it. Thomas nodded. He returned to the buckles. The silence stretched between them, no longer uncomfortable but companionable. Outside the tent, the crowd was beginning to thin. Nobles were returning to their carriages, servants folding benches, scribes comparing notes. The black banners had been lowered. One by one, the traces of the duel were being erased from the square, but not from memory. In a town like Balje, stories like this were not forgotten. They would be told and retold, of the knight who fought to defend his name, of the young noble who dared face him, of the moment when one man could have struck a killing blow and chose not to. And in each retelling, the silence of that final moment where sword met will and will met mercy would echo again. Later that evening, as the sky turned a dusky lavender and the bells of the abbey tolled the 9th hour, a servant arrived at Alaric's lodging with a sealed parchment. The seal was simple, an unmarked circle pressed into wax. Alaric opened it slowly. The handwriting was careful, almost too precise. Sir Alaric, I misjudged you. I acted upon what I believed, not what I knew. The sword has shown me the difference. My house will not speak against you again, and I will carry the weight of my error as a man should. Alaric read the note twice, then folded it and placed it atop his traveling satchel. He poured himself a cup of water, sat by the window, and listened to the sounds of the village drifting upward. Laughter, carts, distant singing. He did not feel joy, nor did he feel vindicated, but he felt still. And in that stillness, something close to peace began to settle over him, like dust after a storm, quiet and slow and real. Night crept into Balje not as a sudden arrival, but as a patient tide. Shadows lengthened until they swallowed the corners of the alleys and crept beneath the thresholds of every house, every chapel, every stable. The stars emerged reluctantly, one by one, faint and flickering against the deepening blue of the summer sky. In the upper room of the inn, where Sir Alaric had taken residence during the days leading up to the duel, a single candle burned low. Its flame wavered with every breeze that slipped through the cracks in the old timber shutters. The air inside was quiet, still thick with the scent of iron, leather, and the faint salt of sweat. Alaric sat in a wooden chair near the hearth, though no fire had been lit. He had removed his armor hours ago. Now he wore only a loose tunic and linen trousers, the fabric clinging slightly to his skin in the humid dark. His sword lay across his knees, not polished, not cleaned yet, but resting as if it too were weary. He had not spoken since dusk. Thomas had long since gone to bed in the adjoining room, exhausted from the day's events. The boy had offered to stay awake, to clean the armor or ready the horses, but Alaric had simply placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded toward the cot. That had been enough. Now alone, Alaric stared at the candle, the flame mirrored in his eyes. Not flickering, steady. The parchment from Emeric remained on the table beside him, unread again since afternoon. But its presence was felt, not as a burden, nor a prize, as something in between, a weight of meaning, a message of closure, perhaps, or the beginning of one. And yet the stillness did not bring rest. From below, faint echoes of laughter and conversation drifted up through the floorboards, the voices of travelers and townsfolk drinking away the tension of the day. But Alaric did not hear them, not truly. His mind had turned inward, drawn down the dark corridors of memory. He had faced many men across the years, some in war, others in rituals like today's. He had crossed swords on muddy hillsides, in narrow keeps, in rain-soaked fields so far from civilization that only the crows knew what transpired. But this duel, this one felt different, not because of the stakes. Those had been high before, not because of the danger. That was always present, but because it had made him remember. And memory was a blade of its own. He leaned back in the chair, joints groaning slightly, and closed his eyes. He let the candlelight press against the back of his lids. Let the sounds fade. Let the memory come. It was another duel, years ago, a forest clearing near the border of Aquitaine. The air had been thick with pine sap and the muffled rush of wind through high branches. He had stood across from a man named Sir Gawain, a knight of reputation, of honor. The accusation then had been one of theft, a dispute over the spoils of a raided stronghold. The details had blurred in Alaric's memory, but he remembered the duel, and he remembered what had gone wrong. Gawain had fought well, honorably, with precision. The two had traded blows for what felt like an eternity, until Gawain slipped, just once, a missed footing on moss-covered stone. Alaric had moved by instinct. His sword had come down, quick, clean, final. The strike had pierced beneath the gorget into the soft space of the neck. And Gauvin had died. Not immediately. He had fallen to his knees, eyes wide, mouth opening once as if to speak, and then he was still. Alaric had stood over him, sword red, breath heavy, and felt nothing. Not pride, not grief, nothing. And that emptiness had stayed with him for months. Even now, years later, it stirred again, like sediment in a still pond, awakened by a passing shadow. He opened his eyes slowly. The candle had burned lower, its wick bending, its flame thinner. The room had grown colder. He rose from the chair, careful not to disturb the sword, and walked to the window. The shutters creaked as he eased them open. The night greeted him gently. Outside, the cobbled street glimmered with the last sheen of moonlight. A cat moved silently across the rooftops. A single lantern flickered in the courtyard below, left forgotten on a post. Beyond the town, the fields stretched into darkness, and further still, unseen but known, the forests, the roads, the quiet places of the world where swords still spoke and men still bled to be heard. He rested his arms on the windowsill and looked out. He did not think of Emeric, not directly, but he thought of what the boy had shown, conviction, not arrogance, the willingness to be wrong, the strength to stand in front of judgment and accept its outcome without bitterness. And that, Alaric thought, was rare. He did not yet know if it would change anything, if Emeric's letter would silence the rumors, if the stain on his name would truly fade. Such things live long in the mouths of men, but for now he was uncondemned, and that, for the first time in years, felt like enough. He turned from the window, returned to the table, and finally reached for the cloth to begin cleaning his blade, one slow stroke at a time. The candle flickered lower still, and in the quiet, with the rhythm of metal and cloth, the memory of violence softened, not vanished, but tempered. The next morning did not arrive with trumpets or bells, but with the gentle insistence of light through old, uneven shutters. The sun rose slowly over Baugé, stretching long fingers of warmth across rooftops and silencing the chill that had settled overnight. The dew glistened on the cobblestones, and the birds began their quiet declarations from the gables and chimneys above. Smoke curled upward from kitchen hearths and bakeries, soft and sweet with the smell of flour and ash. Life resumed, as it always did, as though nothing unusual had passed the day before. But something had, and the town knew it. People spoke with quieter voices that morning. Shopkeepers opened their stalls more slowly. Children who had watched the duel whispered in alleyways, reenacting sword strikes with sticks and broken brooms. Even the dogs seemed more contemplative, padding through the streets without their usual wild energy. Inside the inn, Sir Alaric rose before the first knock at his door. He had not slept long, nor deeply, but he had rested, enough to make his body functional again, enough to keep his thoughts from drifting too far backward. He dressed simply, dark wool and a travel-stained cloak, no armor, no sword at his hip, just the heavy boots of a man accustomed to uneven roads and long distances. When he opened the door, Thomas stood there already dressed, eyes bright despite the early hour. "They've brought the horses," the boy said. Alaric nodded and stepped into the hall, pulling the cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Good?" They did not speak much as they descended the stairs. The common room was quiet, save for an old man sweeping near the hearth and the low clatter of mugs being arranged behind the bar. The innkeeper offered a polite bow. No words, just a nod, and Alaric returned it. Outside, the morning smelled of bread and damp earth. The sky was pale blue with wisps of clouds slowly unraveling in the warmth. 2 horses waited near the stable gate, already saddled. Thomas walked ahead to check the straps and buckles. He moved with precision now, a growing confidence in his hands. Alaric watched him for a moment, then turned toward the far end of the square. It was mostly empty now. The platform had been disassembled. The timbers stacked neatly by the side, the black banners removed. Only faint impressions on the ground remained, worn patches in the grass and dust where men had stood and spectators had gathered. He approached the center, slowly, until he stood where he had raised his sword the day before. The same ground, the same quiet, but something within him had shifted. He closed his eyes just for a moment and breathed. Then footsteps behind him. He turned, and there, standing beneath the shadow of an awning, was Lord Emeric. No armor now, just a finely tailored coat of dark green embroidered with a golden falcon. His right arm was wrapped in linen, and the edge of the bandage peeked from beneath his sleeve. He walked carefully, as though some stiffness remained in his legs and ribs. But he walked with intention. Alaric said nothing. Emeric stopped a few paces away and regarded the older knight with a quiet, level gaze. There was no challenge in it, no pride, only resolve. "I wanted to see it again," Emeric said. His voice was softer than it had been in the court proceedings, less measured, more honest. He glanced down at the disturbed ground beneath their feet. "Standing here yesterday," he continued, "I thought I understood what this place meant, the weight of it, the ceremony, the symbolism. But I didn't, not really." Alaric's face remained calm, unreadable. "I thought it was a test," Emeric went on, "of skill, of righteousness. I believed that if I fought well, if I stood my ground, I'd find justice waiting for me on the other side." He looked up. "But that's not what a duel is it?" "No," Alaric said quietly, "it's not." Emeric nodded slowly. "It's a reckoning, not just with your opponent, with yourself. With the question of whether you're willing to carry the truth, even when it's not the one you wanted." He let those words linger, then took a breath. "I was wrong," he said, "about you, about what I thought I knew." Alaric didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I'm leaving Valje today," Emeric said. "My steward has arranged our passage back to Vere. I won't be staying in the court's orbit for a while." Alaric studied him. "And what will you do?" Emeric shrugged, though it was a careful motion. "Ride, think, probably bleed a little more when the bandages come off, and maybe find out who I am without the armor and the name." There was a silence between them. Not tense, not awkward, just honest. Then Emeric reached into his coat and withdrew a small, flat object wrapped in cloth. He extended it. Alaric accepted it cautiously and unwrapped the linen to reveal a narrow pendant of polished iron, shaped like a stylized falcon's wing. "My father wore that," Emeric said, "until he passed it to me when I came of age. It's not a trinket, it's a weight, a reminder." Alaric looked at the object, then back at the young man. "I want you to keep it," Emeric said, "not as a trophy, but as a mark, a bond, so I don't forget what I saw in you and what I saw in myself." Alaric hesitated, then nodded once, closing the cloth and slipping it into the inner pocket of his cloak. Emeric exhaled as if a tension had been quietly released from his ribs. "I hope our paths cross again," he said. Alaric offered a faint smile. "If they do, may it not be on a platform." Emeric smiled too, tired but genuine. Then he turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady, until he vanished into the growing bustle of the town. Alaric stood alone for a moment longer, then turned back toward the stable. Thomas was adjusting the saddlebag straps. He looked up as Alaric approached. "Ready?" Alaric nodded. "Let's ride." And so they mounted and turned their backs to the town. The hooves of their horses struck soft rhythms on the cobblestones, echoing faintly behind them. The road ahead was long, winding, and uncertain, but the past for now had been laid to rest. The road out of Valje curved gently through the low hills, weaving its way between farmlands and groves of hazel and beech. In the fresh light of morning, the countryside breathed with quiet life. Cows grazing behind low stone walls, a shepherd guiding his flock up the incline of a distant ridge, and smoke curling upward from a mill house near the riverbank, far beyond the trees. Alaric rode at a steady pace. His horse, a mottled gray gelding named Morian, moved with the even stride of an animal long accustomed to long roads and heavier burdens. The saddle creaked softly beneath him, and the reins rested loosely in his hands. Beside him, Thomas rode a smaller chestnut mare, her coat gleaming reddish gold in the rising sun. Neither of them spoke for a long time, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing that needed to be said. The silence between them was a companion, not a stranger. It walked alongside the horses, moving with them through the hush of morning, letting the world fall away behind them, league by quiet league. Around midday, they crested a rise that overlooked the shallow bend of a river. The water shimmered gently in the sunlight, moving slowly between banks thick with cattails and reeds. On the far side, an old stone bridge spanned the river's width, moss-covered and narrow. Alaric pulled up his horse and shaded his eyes with one hand. "That bridge," he murmured. Thomas looked over. "You've been here before?" "Once," Alaric said, "years ago, in winter. The river was swollen then, broke the banks and flooded half the valley." He dismounted, stretching one leg then the other, and approached the edge of the road where a cluster of flat stones offered a place to rest. He sat, and without being asked, Thomas followed suit, tying the reins of both horses to a nearby stump. They shared bread and dried meat in silence. The food was plain, dense rye loaf and salted pork, but it was enough. After a while, Thomas glanced at Alaric, chewing slowly. "Do you think he'll be all right?" Alaric didn't answer immediately. He broke a piece of bread and tossed it to the ground near his feet. A small bird, bold and brown with bright eyes, fluttered down to peck at the crumbs. "Alaric said finally. Thomas nodded. Alaric leaned back, hands braced behind him on the stone. He gazed out over the river. "He will change," Alaric said. "What becomes of that change is his to decide." Thomas considered that. He seemed sincere. He was, but being sincere doesn't make people better. "No," Alaric said, turning to look at him, "but it makes them human." Thomas nodded slowly. The breeze stirred his hair. They sat a while longer. The sun crept higher, the shadows shortening. Eventually Thomas spoke again. "Was that your last duel?" Alaric looked away. Down the slope, the river passed over a bed of pale stones, murmuring to itself like a restless sleeper. "I don't know," he said. "But you're cleared now?" Thomas said. "You don't need to fight anymore." Alaric looked at the boy, studying the earnestness in his face. There was hope there, a longing for a world where justice, once served, required no further reckoning. But Alaric had lived too long to believe in such endings. "I was cleared of one accusation," he said gently. "There will always be others, not always spoken aloud, not always delivered with parchment and seals, but they will come, in whispers, in questions, in looks from across banquet halls." "But why?" "Because I'm still standing," Alaric said. "And men who remain standing long enough become mirrors. People see what they want to see in us, their fears, their doubts, their ambitions, their past." Thomas frowned. "That seems unfair." "It is." And with that, Alaric stood again, dusted his hands, and returned to his horse. They crossed the bridge in single file. The stone was worn smooth from centuries of hooves and wheels and bare feet. Halfway across, Alaric paused and looked down at the water. He could see his reflection there, distorted by the current. It shimmered and flickered with every ripple. His face seemed older somehow, framed in the flow. He turned away. On the far bank, the road split, one path leading south toward the coast, the other east into the forest lands of Chavans. They took the eastern route. The forest swallowed them quickly. Tall trunks rose like pillars in a cathedral, branches weaving a green canopy above. Dappled sunlight flickered across their faces. Birds called from high boughs, and insects buzzed softly in the underbrush. Here the world felt ancient. Thomas rode closer, eyes scanning the trees. "Do you think the old kings walked here?" he asked. "Perhaps," Alaric said. "If they did, they were probably lost." The boy laughed. The laughter echoed briefly in the trees before being claimed by the quiet. They rode on. Miles passed. The forest deepened. Occasionally they saw signs of old settlements, crumbled stone foundations, moss-covered wells, bits of wrought iron buried in the soil. Ghosts of lives long past. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing where the trees opened like a curtain to reveal a small glade, lush with grass and lit golden by the sun's descent. A brook trickled through it, clear and cold. Alaric dismounted again and knelt at the water's edge, cupping a drink into his hands. It tasted of roots and stone, pure, undisturbed. Thomas followed suit. Then he lay back in the grass, arms stretched wide, eyes to the sky. "This," he said, "feels like peace." Alaric didn't reply. He watched a butterfly drift lazily across the clearing. He listened to the sound of the brook, the leaves, the heartbeat of the world untouched. And he wondered quietly if peace was a place one could reach, or merely a moment that passed through, like the wind. Evening settled upon the glade like a silk cloak drawn over weary shoulders. The light turned amber, then deepened into a soft rose before slipping behind the trees. The sky, once open and pale, now burned at the horizon with streaks of violet and copper. A hush descended with the twilight, not the silence of nothingness, but the sacred quiet that comes just before the first star appears. Alaric sat beside the brook, tending to a small fire he'd built from dry branches gathered from the forest's edge. The flames crackled softly, casting orange shadows that danced across his face, deepening the lines beneath his eyes and along the edge of his jaw. He fed the fire slowly, thoughtfully, one stick at a time. Thomas was still lying in the grass nearby, arms folded behind his head, gazing up at the canopy above. The boy hadn't spoken in some time. His breath had slowed, but he wasn't asleep. Just still, listening. The forest made its own music at dusk, the whisper of breeze through the treetops, the soft call of birds settling in their nests, and the first tentative chirps of crickets beginning their nocturnal hymn. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, long and low. Alaric leaned back from the fire and reached for a small pouch at his side. He withdrew a length of dried apple and offered a piece to Thomas. The boy accepted it without sitting up. "Do you ever miss it?" Thomas asked softly. "The war?" Alaric chewed slowly, swallowed. "No, but you think about it." "Sometimes," Alaric admitted. "The men more than the battles, the moments in between, the nights like this when everything was quiet and no one knew what would come in the morning." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Then my father fought at Les Stour." Alaric glanced at him. "I remember the name." "He didn't come back." Alaric gave a slow nod. "Many didn't." "I used to dream," Thomas said, still watching the sky, "that he survived, that he just walked away from it, left the sword behind, found a small village, started over, that he'd write me one day, or come walking up the road with a limp and a smile." The boy's voice wavered, just slightly, but he didn't blink. His eyes remained on the stars beginning to emerge, pale and cold above the black limbs of the trees. "I held on to that for years," he continued. "Then one day I saw a list of the dead in the corner of an old monastery ledger. His name was there, neatly written, no mark beside it, just a name among hundreds." Alaric stirred the fire gently with a stick, sending up a small spiral of sparks. "There's a cruelty in how simply men are forgotten," the knight murmured. "But it is not your father's name I remember from Les Stour. It's the cries, the thunder of hooves, the smell of burning canvas and iron, the way the ground trembled beneath the weight of it all. And then, the silence that followed." He looked at Thomas, eyes reflecting the fire. "Your father stood on ground that many feared to walk, and he didn't vanish. He gave something. Whether the world remembers or not, that sacrifice mattered." Thomas sat up slowly, drawing his knees to his chest. "I want to be brave," he said. "Like him. Like you." Alaric gave a faint, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No," he said. "You don't want to be like me." Thomas turned to him, confused. "You want to be better," Alaric said. "You want to see what I've seen and still carry hope. That's the part I lost." Thomas looked down at the grass between his knees, fingers brushing the blades. "I'm not sure I know how," he whispered. "Then you're already further along than I was at your age," Alaric replied. They sat together in the firelight, the boy and the knight, bound not by blood, but by a kind of quiet loyalty that had grown unspoken between them. The fire's warmth pulsed against the cool air, keeping the shadows at the edge of the glade at bay. Eventually, Alaric reached into his cloak and withdrew the cloth-wrapped pendant Emeric had given him. He unwrapped it, holding the polished iron wing in the palm of his hand. It caught the firelight and glimmered faintly, like a memory half remembered. Thomas leaned forward. "Is that his?" Alaric nodded. "His father's before him." He turned the pendant slowly in his hand. "I've worn many tokens over the years, talismans, oaths, pieces of other men's faiths. This one, I don't quite know what to make of yet." He wrapped it again and tucked it away. "But I'll carry it," he added, "for now." Thomas lay back again, and silence returned, a softer silence than before, the kind that settled not from absence but understanding. Later, Alaric banked the fire, laying stones around its edge, then spread a blanket over the grass beside it. He lay down, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife by his side. The stars thickened above them, glittering like frost across the heavens. Somewhere far beyond the treetops, a night breeze moved the leaves in a long, whispering sigh. And beneath that great cathedral of dark and light, they slept, two figures beneath the canopy of the world, carried forward by something quiet, unspoken, and deeply human. The morning arrived with mist, not light. It clung to the earth like breath held in prayer, rising in wisps from the soil, draping the trees in veils of pale silver. Every leaf and blade of grass glittered with moisture. The brook had grown quieter in the mist, its voice muffled as though softened by reverence for the hour. Alaric woke before the sun breached the horizon. He opened his eyes slowly, letting the hush of the forest fill his senses. The fire had long since died, leaving only a dark ring of ash and a faint scent of charred wood. Nearby, Thomas still slept, curled in his blanket like a pup beside a hearth. Alaric sat up, stretching his arms with slow deliberation, feeling the stiff protests of muscle and joint. His body bore the weight of years and impact, not just from the duel with Emeric, but from every fall, every campaign, every hour spent on roads like this one. He stood and walked to the brook again, kneeling at the edge. The water was cold, shocking against his skin as he cupped it to his face. The sensation was bracing, awakening. As the droplets slid down his neck and into the collar of his tunic, he looked at the mist around them and remembered another place, another morning, another kind of fog. It had been deep in the marshlands of Vardon, a scouting party nearly lost in the white curtain of dawn. He and 3 others. Only one had returned with him. The memory passed like a shadow. He shook his head gently, stood, and wiped his face with a cloth from his belt. Behind him, Thomas stirred. The boy sat up, rubbing his eyes, blinking into the shifting light. "It's like a dream," he murmured. "It's real," Alaric replied, "though it won't stay long." They ate a simple meal, hard cheese, the last of the bread, and apples sliced with a steady hand. Then they packed their things, saddled the horses, and mounted, the leather creaking beneath their weight. The mist parted around them as they re-entered the forest path. Their pace was slower now, not from fatigue, but caution. Visibility was poor, and the trail, narrow and winding, demanded attention. The hooves of their horses made a soft, rhythmic sound on the damp earth, muffled as though even the forest wanted to tread lightly. Hours passed in quiet. The sun rose, but remained veiled behind a curtain of gray. Shafts of light would pierce it now and then, golden and fleeting, like glimpses of something divine through cathedral windows. It was late morning when the sound came, a distant clang of metal, sharp, sudden, then silence. Alaric halted his horse with a raised hand. Thomas stopped beside him, eyes wide. They listened. Another clang, then the unmistakable whinny of a startled horse. Alaric dismounted, slowly, quietly. He handed his reins to Thomas. "Take the horses behind the ridge," he said. "Keep them still." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. He nodded and led the horses carefully off the path into a thicket of bracken and moss. Alaric waited until they were concealed before he moved forward. He walked with practiced care, boots barely breaking the underbrush, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The mist helped him, dampening sound, cloaking his silhouette. As he crested a low rise, the forest opened into another glade, smaller than the one they had slept in, and ringed with tall oaks. In the center stood 3 men. 2 were armed, lightly armored, mismatched pieces, travel-worn chain, dented shoulder guards, and blades that showed signs of frequent use. Mercenaries, perhaps, or something worse. Their horses stood nearby, tethered loosely to a crooked tree. The 3rd man knelt on the ground. His hands were bound. A merchant by the look of him, fine boots, travel cloak embroidered with his house's crest, now muddied and torn. A leather satchel lay open at his side, its contents strewn, coin purses, scroll tubes, a few personal trinkets. One of the armored men kicked him hard in the side. Alaric exhaled slowly. Then he stepped into the clearing. The mercenaries turned at once, hands on hilts. "Easy," Alaric said, voice level. They eyed him, measuring. His cloak hid most of his figure, but they would see the sword, the stance, the calm. "Keep walking," one of them growled. "Nothing here concerns you." Alaric looked at the merchant, then at the spilled satchel. "Release him," he said. The 2nd mercenary, taller and older, chuckled. "And why would we do that?" Alaric took a step forward. "Just one." The taller man drew his blade. That was enough. Alaric moved like water poured into a mold. The sword came free in a single smooth motion. His feet shifted, his weight lowered, and then he surged. The 1st mercenary barely raised his weapon before Alaric struck. The blade glanced off his pauldron and bit into the space beneath his arm. He cried out, staggered backward, dropped his sword. Blood soaked his sleeve. The taller one lunged. Alaric parried the strike with the flat of his blade and stepped into the man's space. A twist of the wrist, a shoulder to the chest, and the mercenary stumbled. Alaric's pommel struck the man's helm with a hollow crack, sending him to his knees. Both assailants groaned on the forest floor, not dead, but disarmed and humiliated. Alaric turned to the merchant. "Are you hurt?" The man shook his head quickly. No, just shaken. Alaric knelt and cut the ropes from his wrists. The merchant rubbed them, wincing. Thank you, he said, voice trembling. They were waiting near the crossing. I hired them as escorts, fools that I am. Alaric stood. You're lucky they didn't kill you. The man nodded, shame coloring his face. Alaric turned to the mercenaries. Leave your weapons, he said, and go. The taller one grunted, hand pressed to his head. You'll regret. Alaric stepped forward again, just once. The man fell silent. The two of them staggered to their feet, collected their mounts, and vanished into the trees. Thomas emerged from the ridge a moment later, leading the horses. He took in the scene, the bound ropes, the blood, the silence. You didn't kill them, he said. No. Why not? Alaric took the merchant's satchel and returned it to him. Because it wasn't a duel, he replied. It was a choice. And with that, they mounted once more and continued into the mist. The forest, now quieter than before, closed behind them. The mist did not lift until late afternoon. It faded slowly, reluctantly, like the trailing hymn of a departing specter, dissolving into the branches above as the sun broke through in quiet shafts. Patches of blue sky emerged overhead, and the forest transformed. Colors once muted by gray now bloomed into vibrant hues, the deep green of moss on stone, the amber shimmer of sunlight on bark, and the soft gold that lit the dust motes dancing in the air. Alaric and Thomas rode on, the road now firmer beneath their horses' hooves. The incident in the glade was already behind them, the echoes of violence softened by time and motion, yet it lingered in small ways. Thomas was quieter than usual, his posture a little straighter, his eyes scanning the trees with more awareness than before. They passed a small shrine in the early evening, a stone arch half consumed by ivy, with a wooden figure of Saint Timon nestled beneath it. The saint's face was weathered, the details of his features long worn smooth by rain and reverent hands. Beneath him, dozens of offerings had been left, coins, carved tokens, a child's ribbon, and a sprig of rosemary bound with twine. Alaric slowed. He dismounted and approached the shrine, removing his gloves as he did. Thomas remained seated, watching silently. Alaric knelt. He didn't pray, not with words, but he rested his hands on his knees and bowed his head. Not for long, just enough to feel the stillness of the place settle around him, like dust in old rafters. He reached into his cloak and withdrew the cloth-wrapped pendant. Slowly, he unwrapped the falcon wing and held it in his palm. The iron was warm from being so close to his chest. After a moment, he placed it gently on the shrine's ledge, beside the rosemary. Thomas sat up in the saddle. You're leaving it? Alaric stood. I've carried it far enough. But it was a gift. Alaric nodded. And now it's a burden. He stepped away from the shrine and returned to his horse. Thomas said nothing more, but as they rode on, he turned once to look back at the small wooden figure, now cradling the wing of a falcon among the tokens of peasants and pilgrims. They made camp that night beside a low stone wall, the remains of what had once been a shepherd's enclosure. Only one corner remained standing. The rest had crumbled into heaps of lichen-covered rock. The grass grew long there, soft and swaying in the breeze. Thomas gathered wood while Alaric unpacked their gear. The fire came quickly, the kindling dry from the afternoon sun. They roasted strips of salted venison over the flames, eating with quiet satisfaction. When they were finished, Alaric leaned back against the stone wall, arms folded. Thomas sat across from him, poking at the embers with a stick. You said something today, the boy said. After the fight, you said it wasn't a duel, that it was a choice. Alaric nodded. It was. Thomas frowned thoughtfully. What makes them different? Alaric tilted his head, considering. A duel is agreed upon, he said slowly. It's a ritual, bound by custom, watched by witnesses. It isn't just two men fighting, it's the law made manifest. A way for one man to say, I will stand in the storm and let my cause be judged by steel. Thomas nodded. And the mercenaries? They weren't seeking judgment, they were taking, preying on weakness. What I did wasn't justice, it was intervention. Thomas poked at the fire again. Sparks leapt upward. But it looked the same, he said. A fight is a fight. No, Alaric replied, his voice soft. A fight is never just a fight. It's what's beneath it that matters. He looked into the flames, his eyes far away. I fought for pay, for pride, for protection. I fought for kings and causes, for oaths and revenge. But the only fights that stayed with me were the ones that came with choice, when I could have walked away and didn't. The fire popped softly, as if in answer. Thomas said nothing for a long while. Then, did you ever walk away? Alaric's eyes did not leave the fire. Once. He didn't elaborate, and Thomas didn't ask. The silence between them grew long, but not uncomfortable. It stretched like a cloak drawn against the night. Above them, the stars emerged once more, brighter now, freed from the haze of the earlier mist. They blinked in the dark like distant eyes watching from the edges of the world. Alaric lay back against the stone, folding his hands behind his head. The stone was cold through the wool of his cloak, but grounding. Thomas wrapped himself in his blanket and curled close to the fire. The night deepened, and as sleep pulled them slowly beneath its quiet current, the words from earlier lingered, drifting above the dying coals. A fight is never just a fight. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and old earth through the clearing. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled once, low and distant. And then, only the steady hush of the trees breathing in the dark. Morning came with golden light spilling like honey through the gaps in the treetops. The forest was hushed in that sacred hour just before the world wakes fully, when birds sing not for show but out of instinct, and dew clings stubbornly to the smallest leaf. The fire had burned itself to ash, a faint curl of smoke rising from the embers like the last thread of a fading dream. Alaric stirred first, as he always did. He sat up slowly, his joints stiff but not painful. The years had taught him how to wake gently, without the jerking urgency of a man always under threat. That reflex had dulled, not because he had grown slower, but because he had learned the difference between danger and memory. He stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, where the stone wall gave way to a sloping hill. From there he could see the landscape open before him, the green canopy stretching for miles, broken now and then by meadows, the glittering line of a distant river, and a single tall tower rising from the horizon like the needle of a compass. He knew that tower. Calvain, he muttered under his breath. Behind him, Thomas was waking. The boy stretched with a groan and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Where are we? Alaric nodded toward the distant spire. Half a day from Calvain. Thomas stood and joined him at the ridge. He squinted into the distance. What is it, a keep? A monastery, Alaric said, though it's built like a fortress. Stone walls, iron gates. They say the tower holds a bell that can be heard across 5 valleys. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. Have you been there? Once, Alaric said. A long time ago. He didn't elaborate, and Thomas didn't press. The boy had learned the rhythm of the night's silences, how to let them sit undisturbed until they were ready to yield meaning. They broke camp quietly, eating a quick meal and checking the horses before setting out. The trail had widened slightly, better maintained now that they were nearing a region with settlements. Wheel ruts carved the dirt in soft arcs, and the occasional wooden signpost pointed the way forward, weathered but legible. As they rode, the land began to shift. The trees grew thinner, the underbrush less wild. Stone fences reappeared, moss-covered and crumbling in places, but still standing. Birds circled above fields freshly plowed. The air carried the scent of tilled soil, of livestock, of baking bread, civilization reasserting itself. Then, just past noon, they crested a rise and saw it fully, Calvain. The monastery stood atop a low hill, its gray stones catching the sunlight. Tall, narrow windows watched over the surrounding land like eyes behind deep hoods. The outer walls were high and solid, built not just for seclusion but for defense. A broad courtyard unfolded within the walls, marked by gardens and gravel paths. Beyond it, the central tower stretched skyward, simple, imposing, crowned by a wrought iron cross. As they approached the gate, a bell rang once, deep and slow. 2 figures in dark robes stood at the entrance, their heads cowled, hands folded. They said nothing as Alaric and Thomas dismounted. They simply opened the gate and gestured them inward, as if they had been expected. Thomas hesitated. Do they know who you are? Perhaps, Alaric said. Or perhaps they know who I used to be. They entered in silence. Inside the monastery walls, time seemed to move differently. The air was cooler, the light dimmer. The sounds softened, footsteps on stone, the distant echo of chanting, the rustle of wind in the cloisters. It was a place carved from rhythm, not reaction. A young monk approached them in the courtyard, his robe hem trailing slightly behind him. Sir Alaric, he said, bowing his head, we've prepared a room for you. Alaric inclined his head. Thank you, brother. The monk turned to Thomas. Your squire will be housed nearby. If he needs anything, he may ask for Brother Estienne. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but Alaric touched his shoulder gently. Go, he said. Rest. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Alaric followed the monk through the cloister halls. Their footsteps echoed faintly off the worn stone. Along the way, they passed frescoes, faded but still powerful, depicting saints in battle, monks transcribing books, and angels hovering over fields of sorrow, scenes of struggle and stillness alike. At last they reached a narrow chamber, a bed of straw and wool, a table, a pitcher of water, a single window facing the courtyard. It was enough. I was told you might come, the monk said, turning to him. You've been here before. Alaric gave a quiet nod. Years ago. And now? Now, Alaric said. I need to be reminded. The monk didn't ask what of. He simply bowed and left, closing the door behind him. Alaric stood in the quiet. He walked to the window and looked out. The sun had shifted again, shadows drawing long across the courtyard. A pair of monks knelt in the garden below, tending to the herbs. He closed his eyes. In this place, there were no swords, no accusations, no bloodied fields, only breath, only memory, only the long echo of bells across old stone. He had come here once long ago, not to fight, but to recover from one. The battle had been brutal, the victory unclear. His injuries then were deeper, bone and soul alike. And now, all these years later, he found himself drawn back not for healing, but for something quieter. Recognition. He walked to the basin, poured water into the bowl, and washed his hands slowly. Outside, the bell rang again, this time higher, softer, like a question. And in that sound, something stirred in him. Not an answer, not yet, but the beginning of one. The bell tolled once more before dusk, its tone rich and deliberate, neither mournful nor celebratory, but something in between. A reminder of time's passage, measured not by urgency, but by rhythm. Alaric remained in the chamber for a while, seated by the window as the sun slipped lower, shadows lengthening across the monastery grounds. He watched the courtyard below, where monks moved with quiet purpose, watering plants, sweeping flagstones, lighting lanterns in alcoves where twilight had begun to pool. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply sat in the hush of the moment, letting the silence work upon him. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the kind that invited thought, memory, reckoning. On the table beside him lay his sword, wrapped in linen, not for concealment, but for containment. In this place, steel was not forbidden, but discouraged. The weapon's weight remained familiar, but it felt foreign in the shadow of these walls, like a relic of another life he hadn't yet finished living. Eventually a knock came. Soft. 2 taps. Then the sound of the door creaking open. Thomas stood there, uncertain. The firelight from the hallway behind him made his silhouette glow faintly. May I come in? He asked. Alaric nodded. The boy stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold before closing the door behind him. They gave me a pallet in the lower hall, Thomas said. It's comfortable, strange, but peaceful. Alaric gestured toward the stool across from him. Sit. Thomas did. For a moment, the two said nothing. Just the faint sound of chanting drifted from the chapel wing, low, melodic, like a lullaby hummed by the earth itself. Then Alaric spoke. Do you know why this place is built like a fortress? Thomas shook his head. Because in the early years of the order, they were hunted, Alaric said. Not for what they believed, but for what they remembered. Thomas looked puzzled. They kept records, names, events, the truth of things that others wanted buried. Wars rewritten, oaths broken, betrayals disguised as victories. They hid scrolls in stone walls, built libraries behind altars. He leaned back slightly. And when soldiers came to burn those truths away, they found monks who knew how to hold a gate. Thomas was quiet. So they fought, they endured, Alaric replied. There's a difference. He looked at the window again. I came here after the siege of Valcroix, he continued. I was younger, angry. I had killed men in the name of a lord who betrayed every promise he'd made to the people who followed him. I thought this place might tell me how to carry that weight. And did it? Alaric gave a faint smile. No, but it taught me to ask a different question. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Which was, how to walk without it. The boy looked down, letting the words settle. Then carefully he asked, Do you think I belong with you? Alaric looked at him, truly looked. Thomas had changed. The lines of his face were no sharper, but the expression behind them had shifted. less eager, more searching. He no longer followed merely to obey. He followed now to understand. I think, Alaric said, you belong on the road. Whether it stays beside mine is for you to decide. Thomas nodded slowly. I want to learn, not just how to fight, but how to live with what comes after. Alaric reached forward and poured water into a small cup, then handed it to him. Then start here, he said, with stillness. Thomas took the cup in both hands, holding it carefully, as though it were a relic rather than a simple drink. They sat in silence again, the boy and the knight, separated by age and burden, united by something more fragile than fate and more powerful than words, choice. Outside, the last of the daylight faded and the first stars blinked into being. From the chapel, the chanting ended, replaced by the slow, steady hum of night's arrival. In the distance, beyond the monastery walls, wolves stirred in the forest. The world beyond continued its restless motion. But within the stone sanctum of Calvain, all was still, and that stillness was, for now, enough. The night within Calvain deepened like ink poured into still water. All around the monastery, lanterns flickered behind stone lattice windows, casting long, quivering lines of gold across the flagstone corridors. The gardens slept beneath a thin veil of moonlight, and the wind, hushed and cool, passed through the cloisters like an unseen procession. Alaric lay awake. He had not lit the small candle near his bedside. He preferred the dark, the way it leveled all things. No banners, no titles, no burdens visible. Just the slow breath of stone and the weight of thought. He listened to the rhythm of the place. He heard the creak of old beams settling above him, the scuff of soft sandals passing occasionally beyond his door, monks tending to their midnight prayers, a distant bell too faint to mark an hour, perhaps struck in memory of someone long gone, and beneath it all, the steady murmur of the wind. In the dark, his memories stirred. They came without force, as they often did now, rising slowly from the deep places of his mind, not as visions or dreams, but as sensations. The cold bite of winter mail against his skin, the smell of ash in the folds of a burned village, the muffled sob of a wounded squire too young to know he was dying. But this night, a different memory rose. Not a battle, a woman's voice. He hadn't heard it in years, not since the war in Erlin when he had left without farewell. She had been a healer, one of those who stayed behind after every retreat, risking everything to tend to those left broken in the mud. Her voice had not been soft, it had been firm, grounded, like soil that held the roots of old trees. She had said to him once, "You confuse silence with peace." And he had not understood then. He had nodded, too proud to ask. But now, lying in a quiet room in a monastery far from any throne or battlefield, her words echoed differently. He sat up slowly, bare feet brushing the stone floor. The chill seeped into his bones, familiar and welcome. He rose, took his cloak from the peg, and slipped from the chamber. The halls were dark, but not blind. A few lanterns remained lit, their flames dancing low. He moved silently through the corridors, passing alcoves carved with saints and stone benches worn smooth by centuries of contemplation. He knew where he was going. The archive. Calvain held one of the oldest surviving scriptoriums in the eastern provinces. Its records spanned monarchies, schisms, uprisings, and treaties forgotten by even the most learned courts. Few were allowed into its vaults without permission. Fewer still knew its true contents. But Alaric had once been granted entrance. Not as a knight, not as a guest, but as a man searching for the name of another man he had killed. He found the door just as he remembered it. Iron-banded oak, carved with a symbol of quills crossed over a sword. The handle was cool to the touch. He paused, then opened it. Inside, the scent of ink and dust struck him like a memory of incense. The chamber was narrow and long, its walls lined with shelves that reached upward into shadow. Scrolls, codices, and loose vellum tucked into pigeonholes that had not been disturbed in decades. A single lamp burned at the center table, and beside it, an old man sat. His robes were not black like the monks. They were gray, the color of ash. His beard was white and thin, and his eyes, pale blue and deeply lined, rose to meet Alaric's as if he had been waiting. "Sir Alaric of Montreux," he said without surprise. Alaric inclined his head. "Archivist." The old man gestured to the seat opposite him. "I knew you'd come. You remember me? I remember every man who's ever asked to look into our ledgers at night." Alaric sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the old man reached for a small ledger, leather-bound, plain, marked with only a single number on the spine. "You asked about a name once," he said. "Garenvel." Alaric closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." "He was no one of note," the archivist continued, flipping pages gently. "A foot soldier from the northern marches, illegitimate son of a farmhand, joined a retinue out of need, died at the second charge of Erlin's Gate." Alaric opened his eyes. "I killed him." The archivist didn't flinch. "So did 20 others, most likely. But yes, perhaps it was your sword that found him." He paused, then set the book down. "You asked then if his name would be remembered, if his death mattered." Alaric nodded. The old man leaned forward. "And now you ask again?" "No," Alaric said softly. "Not for him?" Alaric looked up. "For all of it," he said. "For what's left." The archivist studied him. Then slowly he closed the ledger. "In here," he said, tapping the table, "we keep records of what happened, who did what, when, where, to whom, but we cannot write why, nor can we tell you what any of it means." Alaric said nothing. "That part," the archivist went on, "must be carried, not proven, not erased, just understood." Alaric's hands folded before him. "It's heavy." The old man smiled faintly. "It always is." They sat a moment longer in the flicker of lamplight. Then the archivist rose. "Come," he said, "I'll show you something." Alaric followed him through a narrow door into a chamber even smaller than the last. Within it, a single scroll rested on a pedestal beneath a pane of glass. "This," the old man said, "is the first document the monastery ever preserved. A prayer written by a soldier the night before a hopeless battle." Alaric approached. The parchment was faded, the ink brown with age, but the words were still legible. "If I fall, let it be not for glory, but for the one who will survive me and wonder why I fought at all." He read it twice, then again, and something shifted in him, quietly, slowly, like ice melting from the edge of a blade. They left the archive together. Outside, the wind had risen. The tower bell tolled once, its voice carried far into the sleeping countryside, and beneath its echo, Alaric walked back to his chamber, not to forget, but to remember differently. Dawn at Calvain broke not with brilliance, but with restraint. The light seeped in carefully, as if aware it was entering sacred ground. It pressed softly against the stained glass in the eastern chapel, casting muted halos of color onto the worn stone floor. A slow hush still held the monastery's corridors, broken only by the occasional creak of beams or the soft closing of a door. Alaric stood in the chapel, alone. He had risen before the bell, dressed simply in a dark tunic and cloak, and walked barefoot into the heart of the monastery's holiest space. The chapel was narrow, its walls tall and bare except for a single frieze carved into the apse. A figure kneeling with a sword laid at his feet, hands lifted not in triumph, but in surrender. The figure had no face. Alaric had always found that detail haunting. He stood now before the altar, not to pray, but to see, to truly see the image again. The lines of the carving were smooth from age, but the weight in them remained. There was no divinity in the figure's gesture, no righteousness, only release. Behind him, footsteps echoed softly. He turned. Thomas stood at the threshold, shoulders squared, uncertain. Alaric gestured for him to enter. The boy walked quietly to his side, eyes drawn up toward the faceless figure. "What is this place?" Thomas asked. "A chapel to the forgotten knight," Alaric replied. "I've never heard of that saint." "He isn't one." Thomas looked up at him. Alaric continued. "The figure represents the idea that not every warrior is remembered, that some acts of sacrifice, mercy will vanish into time without songs, without statues. This place honors them." He paused, then added, "It honors the ones who laid down their blades for reasons no one will ever know." Thomas stared at the carving for a long time. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "To be forgotten." Alaric didn't answer at once. He looked at the altar again, at the hands raised in surrender, at the sword left untouched. "I don't want songs," he said. "I've seen too many sung for the wrong men, and too many left unsung for the right ones." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then what do you want?" Alaric turned to him. "To be free," he said, "from the need to be anything more than what I am when I'm not holding a sword." He said it softly, but with certainty. They stood in silence after that. Eventually a bell rang in the upper tower, its first toll of morning. Not urgent, just a marker of the hour. The monastery would begin to stir now. Tasks to be done, records to be copied, bread to be baked. Alaric stepped out into the courtyard, the early light cool against their faces. Brother Estienne greeted them beneath the fig tree, where the monks often gathered for announcements. His hands were clasped, his face calm. "The abbot will see you now," he said. Alaric inclined his head. "Thank you." They followed him through a series of arched corridors, past a library whose shutters were being opened to the light, past a hall lined with empty chairs and faded tapestries. At last they came to a door of carved oak, unadorned but old, its grain darkened by countless hands. Estienne knocked once, then opened it and stepped aside. Alaric entered alone. The abbot's chamber was simple: a desk, a chair, a crucifix above the hearth, and a narrow window overlooking the northern fields. A man sat behind the desk, hood drawn back, his silver hair loose around his shoulders. He looked up and smiled. "Sir Alaric," he said, "it has been many years." "Abbot Remy," Alaric replied. The abbot gestured to the seat across from him. "Please." Alaric sat. The abbot studied him for a moment, then said, "You left something here once." "I did. And yet you carry more now." Alaric didn't deny it. Remy reached beneath the desk and produced a small wooden box. It bore no lock. He opened it slowly, revealing a simple dagger inside, a knight's blade, ceremonial, its hilt bound in faded blue cloth. "You left this when you took your vow of silence," the abbot said. "Do you remember?" "I remember breaking it." "That's not what I asked." Alaric looked down at the dagger. "I remember why I left it." "And why did you return now?" Alaric leaned back slightly. "Because I lost a duel, not by blade, but by mercy." The abbot tilted his head. "Explain." "I fought a young man who believed I had wronged him. He demanded justice. I gave him a chance, and he yielded. Then he forgave me." "And that unsettled you?" Alaric nodded. The abbot said nothing for a while. Then he closed the box and set it aside. "There is a kind of weight," he said, "in being spared. We speak often of those who show mercy, but not enough of those who must carry it." He folded his hands. "Mercy is not an ending. It is a door, and when it opens, it asks you to live differently on the other side." Alaric stared at the floor. The light through the window had grown stronger, painting the stone in soft gold. "I don't know how," he said quietly. "Then stay," the abbot said. "Not as penance, not to hide, but to listen, to walk these halls again, without armor, without urgency." Alaric looked up. "For how long?" Remy smiled faintly. "Until you stop asking." A silence passed between them. Then Alaric rose. "I'll need to speak to my squire." "Of course." Alaric left the chamber. He walked out into the courtyard again, where Thomas stood near the herb garden, watching bees drift lazily between the blossoms. The boy turned as Alaric approached. "We'll stay a while," Alaric said. Thomas smiled, and for the first time in many days, Alaric smiled back. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but because it came easily. Days at Calvain did not pass so much as they unfolded, like pages in a book whose story had no climax, no turning point, just a deep and constant rhythm. Alaric settled into that rhythm with the silent resignation of someone who had long carried too many hours marked only by urgency. Here, there were no summons, no blades drawn, no accusations whispered behind walls, just bells, just footsteps on stone, just the breathing of a monastery that had stood for centuries longer than any knight's reputation. Each morning began with the tolling of the bell before sunrise. Alaric rose without needing to be called. He would dress plainly, no armor now, only cloth, and walk the perimeter of the grounds, tracing the path along the outer wall where ivy clung in long ropes and moss crept through the mortar. Sometimes he walked alone. Sometimes Thomas would join him. They spoke little on these walks. They didn't need to. On the fourth day of their stay, Alaric began helping in the gardens. He was given no special task, no honor in his labor. Brother Lucien, the gardener, simply handed him a worn spade and pointed to the western beds where the herbs were tangled and overgrown. Alaric knelt, his knees complaining against the earth, and began to dig. His fingers became streaked with soil. His shoulders burned after the second hour, but he did not stop. There was something steadying in the act, the slow unearthing of roots, the trimming of dead leaves, the way a wild thing, with patience and care, could be coaxed into order without being conquered. Thomas was assigned to the archives, not the vaults, but the outer scriptorium, where he transcribed inventory ledgers and helped oil the leather bindings of older volumes. He was not given quills yet, only ink cloths and parchment weights. But he worked carefully, eyes wide, asking quiet questions when permitted. By the sixth day, the boy had begun to memorize the names of plants in the cloister garden. He could tell lavender from hyssop, sage from southernwood. He followed Brother Estienne with the attentiveness of someone who knew he was learning more than words. And in all that time, neither of them touched a sword. Their weapons remained wrapped in cloth in the small room where they slept, not hidden, not forgotten, but distant, objects set aside like memories too sharp to be held every day. In the evenings, the monastery glowed. The sun would pour into the long hall of columns near the western wing, filling it with gold so thick it looked like fire had taken residence there. Alaric often sat in the cloisters during that hour, a small book in hand, one of the monk's translations of a local history. He didn't read it quickly. He didn't care to reach the end. He read to hear voices other than his own. One evening, as the bell signaled the approach of Compline, Thomas found him beneath the old fig tree in the garden. The boy held a folded parchment in one hand. "They asked me to write something," he said. Alaric looked up. Brother Estienne said every visitor should leave a thought for the record of passage, just a sentence, something to mark that we were here. He handed the parchment to Alaric. Alaric unfolded it. The handwriting was still awkward, letters too large, some lines wavering, but the words were clear. "I came with the night, but I'm leaving with my eyes open." Alaric looked at him. "You're leaving?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet, just preparing. Like you said, we can't stay forever." Alaric handed back the parchment. "No," he said, "we can't." Thomas hesitated. "Are you ready?" Alaric was quiet a long moment. "I'm learning how to be," he said. The boy smiled faintly and returned to the chapel to leave his parchment. That night, after the final bell had rung and the lanterns had been extinguished, Alaric lay awake again, but not with unrest. His body felt different now. Not lighter, but less braced. His breath moved without resistance. His hands, still calloused, no longer twitched for the hilt of a blade. He looked out the narrow window at the stars beyond. They were the same stars he had seen from battlefields, from tavern roofs, from forest clearings. But here they seemed less watchful, less cruel. He remembered something Americ had said, a single sentence, delivered with quiet certainty. "I will carry the weight of my error." Alaric had been thinking about that weight, about what it meant to carry something without it poisoning you, without it turning you into a weapon instead of a man. The monastery had not given him answers. It was not a place of epiphany. It was a place of stillness, and in that stillness he had heard something different. Not a voice, not a call, but the sound of absence, the absence of war, the absence of rage, the absence of having to prove, to defend, to justify. And for the first time in years, Alaric found himself not needing to hold anything. He exhaled. The wind whispered against the stone, and sleep came, soft and whole. On the morning of the 9th day, the wind changed. It came from the north, colder than before, carrying with it the scent of pine smoke and iron. The air grew sharper, the sky a paler blue, and the monks, though unchanged in their movements, began to wear their cloaks earlier in the day. Something in the rhythm of Calvain had shifted, not broken but bent, just slightly, like the first tightening of a string before a new song is played. Alaric felt it immediately. He woke with a strange restlessness beneath his ribs, as though a distant drum had begun to beat somewhere inside him. He dressed as usual, pulled on his boots, and walked his morning circuit, but the steps felt less grounded. The walls of the monastery, once protective, once silent, now echoed faintly with an expectation he could not name. Thomas noticed it too. He joined Alaric by the herb beds that morning, watching Brother Lucian untangle creeping vines from a row of struggling plants. "I dreamed of home last night," the boy said. Alaric knelt beside the sage and loosened the soil around its roots with careful fingers. "And what did it look like?" "Smaller," Thomas said. "Quieter. I remember it being louder, bigger, but in the dream it was just still." Alaric glanced up. "Did you miss it?" Thomas hesitated. "I don't know. I think I missed the idea of it more than the place itself." Alaric nodded. "That's often how it begins." Later that day, a rider arrived, a single figure cloaked in dust, appearing near mid-afternoon at the monastery's outer gate. He bore no colors, no crest, but his posture was unmistakable, straight-backed, armor beneath the wool, the shoulders of a man trained in command. He did not dismount. Brother Estienne met him at the entrance, exchanged a few quiet words, then disappeared into the chapel to retrieve the abbot. Alaric watched from the far end of the courtyard, standing beneath the fig tree, a spade still in his hand. He knew what this was. Not a threat. Not yet, but a summons. When the abbot emerged, he walked slowly, his robes catching in the wind like trailing parchment. He greeted the rider with a gesture of peace, and the two spoke quietly beside the gate. Alaric could not hear their words, but he didn't need to. He saw the moment the abbot turned his head, his pale eyes searching the courtyard, and finding Alaric. He approached later, just before the evening bell. Alone, no riders, no formality. Alaric sat beneath the arch near the old cloisters, sharpening a small pruning knife out of habit. Your name has found its way into other places, the abbot said gently, into ears that do not forget. Alaric stopped sharpening. Whose ears? A minor baron's court to the west, House Marquette. They seek knowledge of a knight once called to the council at Dornevin, one who fought at the fields near Reimholt. Alaric said nothing. The abbot continued. They sent a man to ask if you might still live, and if so, whether you would come speak for yourself. Alaric looked down at the blade in his hand. Its edge was smooth now, clean, unused. Is it accusation? He asked. No, said Remy. Not yet. It's curiosity, which is sometimes more dangerous. Alaric sheathed the blade and leaned back. I've spoken enough for a lifetime. And yet silence can be a verdict of its own, the abbot replied. A pause stretched between them. Then the older man added, more softly, you do not have to go. Not unless you believe it is time. Alaric's eyes moved to the far wall, where Thomas was walking with Brother Estienne, laughing quietly over something the boy held in his hands, a pressed flower perhaps, or a curling page from a torn book. I made a promise once, Alaric said. To whom? Myself, that if I were ever given a second chance to speak before judgment, I wouldn't waste it. Remy inclined his head. Then perhaps the world is giving you that chance. That night, as the lamps were lit and the wind whispered more insistently against the shutters, Alaric told Thomas. The boy sat quietly across from him, the light from the candle between them making his face seem older, more angular in shadow. Will I come with you? Thomas asked. That's for you to decide. I want to, he said, but I want to know what you're walking into. Alaric looked at the boy, not as a squire, not as a follower, but as someone slowly becoming something else, something steady. I don't know what I'm walking into, he said, but I know it's a part of what I've tried to leave behind, and I can't leave it entirely. Thomas nodded, and that was that. The next morning, before the sun had crested the hills, Alaric stood once more at the gate. The rider waited with a fresh horse, its coat the color of smoke, its breath curling in the chill air. The saddle was broad, its tack worn but well kept, a sign that the journey would be long and the path uncertain. Thomas adjusted the strap on his pack. Alaric tightened the wrap around his cloak. They turned once to see the abbot standing atop the western steps, arms folded inside his sleeves. Alaric gave a nod. The abbot returned it, solemn and sure. Then the gate opened, and the world, wide and waiting, received them once again. The road westward unfurled before them, like a ribbon worn by weather and history. It wound gently through the foothills beyond Calvain, first beneath the thinning woods of ash and hornbeam, then down into valleys dusted with autumn's earliest gold. The season had begun to shift. Though the sun still offered warmth by midday, the mornings carried a sharpness that hinted at the coming months, at the frost that would soon cling to the fields and the smoke that would gather low over village roofs. Alaric rode at an even pace. He did not rush, nor did he dawdle. His posture was steady, his hands light on the reins. Beside him, Thomas kept close, his smaller horse trotting to keep up, eyes scanning the horizon with quiet anticipation. They passed no towns that first day. Only scattered cottages and old boundary stones, worn smooth with age. The land here was neither rich nor barren. It bore the look of places that had once seen war, then peace, then neglect. A patchwork of stories without tellers. As evening drew near, they came upon a small inn tucked into the base of a wooded hill, its roof sagging slightly, the sign out front swaying in the breeze. The symbol was an antlered stag carved deep into weathered oak. Inside, the fire was already lit. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered woman with gray hair tied in a thick braid, offered no questions and few words. She gave them a room, stew, and bread. That was enough. They ate quietly. Later, as the fire crackled and a storm began to whisper against the shutters, Thomas spoke. What happened at Dornovan? Alaric didn't answer at first. He sat with one hand around a chipped clay cup of watered wine, eyes fixed on the coals in the hearth. It was a negotiation, he said eventually. A truce meeting, one of many that never held. Were you there as a knight? As a witness, Alaric said, though I didn't know then what I was meant to witness. He leaned back slowly, letting the heat of the fire soak into his bones. There were 3 lords. 2 claimed the same parcel of land. The third claimed neither had a right to it. And the land itself, it didn't matter. It was rock and wind. But the pride behind the claims, that was the true territory being defended. Thomas listened, saying nothing. They asked for knights to attend as neutral parties. I was one, chosen because I'd served none of them in the past. And what happened? A man died, Alaric said quietly, and not in combat. He was found poisoned in his tent. One of the claimants, Lord Vorel. Thomas frowned. Was it you? No, Alaric said, but I was the last man seen speaking with him. He turned toward the fire again, and I did not speak in my defense. I left before the ink had dried on the accusation. Thomas's brow furrowed. Why? Because if I had stayed, Alaric said, I would have drawn my sword, and I was tired of answering questions with steel. He drained the last of the wine and set the cup down gently. I chose silence, and that silence became a shadow. They sat quietly for a time, the inn's only other guest already asleep in the far corner. The fire dimmed, casting long shadows along the ceiling beams. Outside, the rain began to tap more insistently against the window. Finally, Thomas said, "And now they ask you to return." Alaric nodded. "They want to know if I can still be trusted, if I am who I claim to be." "And are you?" Alaric looked over at the boy, and for a moment the mask of the knight, the calm, the certainty, slipped. "I don't know," he said. Later, in their room beneath the slanted roof, Thomas slept with the soft breathing of one still young enough to find comfort in a bed, regardless of what lay ahead. Alaric sat beside the shuttered window, watching the streaks of rain trace down the glass. He had not spoken of Dornovan in years. There had been no trial, no inquiry, just the weight of suspicion left unchallenged. He had walked away from it, and in doing so had allowed it to grow in the dark behind him. Like moss on stone, like mold on bread, he remembered Vorel, an ambitious man, but not cruel. A man who had spoken quickly, laughed rarely, and held his cup with 2 fingers like a man used to measured things. Their conversation had not been long that night, and nothing in it had warned of what would follow. And yet, when the news came in the morning, Alaric's name was on the lips of more than one noble. Perhaps because he had disagreed with Vorel's claim. Perhaps because he had no allies at the table. Perhaps simply because he had not denied it. He closed his eyes. The rain sang its old lullaby, and the road ahead lengthened in his mind, winding toward a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. The road to the Marquette estate grew more defined with each passing mile. After leaving the inn, the landscape changed. The wild hedgerows gave way to trimmed paths. Stone markers bore the sigils of minor houses, carved and whitewashed. Farms were orderly now, fields scored with plows in long, even lines, cottages clustered in neat rows behind hedges pruned with practiced care. This was land held by power, not sprawling wealth, but controlled dignity. It bore the look of a house that had survived storms without ever being the center of one. Alaric noticed the watchtowers first. Low, squat things built of limestone, set far apart but high enough to survey the fields. Flags flew from their tops, blue with a gold hound leaping left. The crest of House Marquette, old, not noble by blood, but elevated through years of loyal service to crown and coin alike. Pragmatic rulers, careful ones. They arrived at the estate gates in the late afternoon. The manor rose behind a low wall of dressed stone, its towers modest, its roof steep and red-tiled. Ivy clung to the eastern wing, and a line of cypresses led toward the courtyard like sentinels frozen in prayer. The main gate was open, but guarded. 2 men stepped forward as they approached, one older, one young and wiry. Both bore mail under dark surcoats, swords belted but not drawn. They watched Alaric closely as he dismounted. "You are expected," said the elder guard. "Sir Alaric of Montrois?" "I am." The man nodded once, then looked past him to Thomas. "Your squire?" Yes. The guard signaled to someone beyond the wall. A moment later, a boy no older than 12 came running. He took the reins of their horses without a word and led them off toward the stables. You'll be received in the North Hall, the guard said. Please follow. They were led through the courtyard, across flagstones scrubbed clean, and through doors of ironwood that creaked just slightly at their hinges. The halls of the estate were not lavish, but they were old, and that lent them authority. Tapestries lined the walls, scenes of harvest, of hunts, of a long-forgotten siege in which a Marquette ancestor had stood upon a burning wall with a broken spear and refused to yield. Alaric took it all in with quiet eyes. Eventually, they reached a chamber with high windows and a long table of dark oak. At the head of the table stood a woman. She was not tall, but she stood like a statue carved from marble, rigid, precise. Her gown was plain but perfectly fitted, belted with a strip of black leather. Her hair, streaked with iron, was pulled into a braid that looped once around her shoulder. No jewels, no pretense, only presence. Sir Alaric, she said. He bowed. My lady. Thomas followed suit, though his movement was a second slower. I am Lady Céline Marquet, she said. My family has overseen this land for 7 generations. I do not extend invitations lightly. I came because I was summoned, Alaric said calmly. No, she replied. You came because you knew silence has limits. She motioned toward the seats. Sit, they obeyed. She did not. I have read every account of Dornovan Still Preserved, she said, and I have spoken to 2 who were present at the summit. Neither could say what truly happened the night Lord Varel died, but both named you. Alaric inclined his head. I do not deny that I was with him the night before he was found. Nor did you deny it then, she said, voice cool, which is why the stain remained. Thomas shifted in his seat. Céline turned slightly. My uncle, she said, was Lord Varel's seneschal. He inherited little when Varel died, less than expected. But he inherited something else, suspicion and grief. Alaric met her eyes. I did not kill your lord. But you did not clear your name, she said. You left. I left because staying would have meant more blood. Or justice, she countered. Alaric was quiet for a moment. Do you seek my punishment? He asked. Céline's expression did not change. I seek the truth, not for vengeance, not for court, but for record. You were there. You saw him last. If you know something, I want it spoken aloud once before history forgets. Alaric leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. There is no proof, he said. Only memory, and the memory is unclear. Try. He closed his eyes. When I saw Varel that night, he said, he was drinking, not heavily, enough to loosen his tongue. He spoke of the land he claimed, but not with love, with frustration. He said it was a burden, too many stones, too few rivers. He said the land would cost more to hold than it would ever yield. He paused. He said he didn't trust the others at the table, not even his allies. Did he name them? She asked. Alaric opened his eyes. He said one of them had offered him a secret bargain, but he wouldn't tell me who. Then what? He asked me what I would do if I were in his position. I told him I'd walk away from it, from all of it. And he laughed, Alaric said quietly. He said, that's why you're a sword and not a banner. And then he dismissed me. I never saw him again. Lady Céline folded her hands. No poison on your blade, no threat in your voice, just words in the dark. Yes, she turned and walked to the window, looking out at the orchard beyond. You know what the world made of your silence. I do. And now, I'm not here to ask forgiveness, he said, only to answer. The silence that followed was long. Finally, she turned. You will dine here tonight. In the morning, I will write the account of this conversation. You may sign it if you choose. If not, it will still be entered into record. Alaric rose. That is fair. She nodded once. And with that, the weight of a memory, not erased but finally spoken, began to shift. Not lifted, but shared. Night fell over the Marquette estate with a hush that reached deep into the bones of its old stone. The manor's torches flickered behind narrow windows, casting shadows that danced along the corridors like the ghosts of forgotten vassals. Beyond the walls, the fields were still. The hounds in the lower kennels had gone quiet. The orchard rustled gently under the breath of the wind, its branches tapping against one another in slow, whispering rhythm. Alaric stood alone in a small chamber adjoining the guest wing. It was neither lavish nor austere, simply built, with a high-beamed ceiling, a writing desk, and a tall-backed chair by the hearth. The fire crackled steadily. Its warmth filled the room with a kind of temporary peace. On the desk lay a single sheet of parchment. Lady Celine's hand was sharp and elegant. The ink had not yet dried fully. At the top of the page, in dark and deliberate script, was the title, Statement of Sir Alaric of Montreux concerning the death of Lord Vorel at Dornovan. Beneath it were the words he had spoken in the hall, transcribed exactly. His recollections, his uncertainty, his refusal to claim more than what he remembered. There were no embellishments, no flourishes, just the quiet record of a conversation long past, and a night whose shadow had stretched across years. A space had been left at the bottom for his signature. He stared at it for a long time. Behind him, the door creaked softly. Thomas entered, carrying 2 mugs of warm cider, the steam curling into the dim light. He handed one to Alaric without a word and sat down on the low stool near the hearth. They drank in silence. She didn't press for more, Thomas said at last. No, Alaric replied. She didn't need to. Do you believe her? Alaric considered. I believe she wanted truth, and I believe that's rarer than justice. Thomas shifted slightly, watching the fire. Will you sign it? Alaric looked down at the page again. I don't know, he said. It's the truth as I remember it, but memory is a fragile blade. It cuts unevenly. Thomas nodded slowly. But if you don't sign it, people will think you're still hiding. I know, but if you do, they might believe you were guilty after all. Just clever enough to sound honest. Alaric smiled faintly. You've been listening well. The boy returned the smile, but it faded quickly. I don't understand how anyone carries this kind of thing, Thomas said. This weight. They don't, Alaric said. Not all the time. They set it down where they can, in pages, in silence, in children they try to teach better than themselves. Thomas looked into the flames again. Alaric rose and walked to the desk. He set the mug aside, reached for the quill, and dipped it in ink. He did not hesitate. He signed, not with the flourish of a nobleman, not with the precision of a clerk, but with the plain, practiced hand of a man who had written his name on orders, treaties, and burial scrolls. A man who had signed too many things, and not enough of the right ones. When it was done, he laid the quill down and exhaled. Thomas watched him. That's it, he asked. No, Alaric said. But it's a start. They slept that night in quiet rooms, high above the orchard. Alaric's dreams were slow and strange. He saw Dornovan again, but not the banners, not the tents, not even Vorel's face. He saw only a lantern swinging in the wind outside a pavilion and the sound of fabric snapping like a sail in a storm. He woke before dawn as he always did. The estate was still asleep. He dressed silently, belted his cloak, and walked through the manor's eastern passage toward the overlook where the orchard began. There, beneath a half-bare apple tree, Lady Celine was already standing, hands clasped behind her back. You didn't sleep, Alaric said. I sleep less the older I get. The morning light broke gently over the horizon. The orchard shimmered with frost. I've sealed the record, she said. Your name will appear in the court logs of Marquette as a witness, not a suspect. Will that be enough? For me, she said. Others will choose their stories. Alaric nodded. You'll ride today? Yes, he said. The road is quieter than it once was, but it still speaks. She looked at him, and for the first time the steel in her eyes softened. I never met Vorel, she said, but I knew his household. I know what ambition made of them. Alaric met her gaze. Ambition leaves deep footprints. She smiled faintly. Go, she said. Before the frost lifts, there's more truth to be found where the ground hasn't yet hardened. He bowed, not deeply but sincerely, and then he turned, walking back toward the stables where Thomas was already preparing their things. The road waited, not with ceremony, not with demand, but with the quiet certainty of distance. And they rode into it, not to escape, but to continue. Not because the past had released them, but because it had, at last, spoken its piece. The road from the Marquette estate curved westward for half a day before veering south, where it narrowed and dipped into a long valley lined with poplar trees. The wind through their leaves made a dry, sighing sound, restless, uncertain. The trail itself was well tended but rarely traveled, marked only by the occasional hoof print or wagon groove faded with time. Alaric rode quietly. Thomas followed, close but not pressing, his gaze occasionally lifting to the ridgelines where birds wheeled in the sky. Neither spoke much. The morning was a long breath held by the land itself, and the silence between them was comfortable, even necessary. They had left with no destination announced, only the knowledge that there was more road ahead. And Alaric, despite the clarity earned at Calvain and the release granted at Marquette, felt something unresolved tugging just beyond the edge of awareness. Not guilt, not fear, something softer. Midday found them in a small village nestled at the foot of a wooded rise. Its name, Ilorn, was carved above the inn's door, the letters shallow and worn. The village boasted little: a well in the square, a tiny chapel with a leaning bell tower, and a scattering of homes made from stacked stone and timber, daubed with clay. But it was clean, quiet, honest. They stopped for bread, cheese, and water. The innkeeper, a round-faced man with a soft voice, asked no questions. He served them and disappeared again, as though sensing the shape of their silence. It was Thomas who broke the stillness. Where to now? Alaric leaned back in his chair, hands wrapped around a warm cup. I've been thinking, he said, of someone I knew long ago, before war shaped the way I carried myself. A friend? Alaric nodded. A brother in arms of sorts. We trained together at Corbin Hall, fought side by side in the early campaigns. He left before I did, disillusioned. What was his name? Radon, Alaric said quietly, son of a blacksmith, no title, but more honor than most men born in halls of stone. Thomas waited. He left the service after a massacre in the Eastern Reach, said if we fought for men who no longer remembered why, we'd become the thing we fought against. And what did you say? I said nothing, Alaric admitted. I stayed. He left. We never spoke again. He looked down at the surface of the table, tracing a ring left by the base of his cup. I heard years later that he'd settled in a place called Harrow's Rest, built a forge, took no surname, made tools, not blades. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Do you want to find him? Alaric didn't answer immediately. I think I want to see what peace looks like when it's chosen, not given. Thomas smiled faintly. Then let's go. They rode out that afternoon, leaving the quiet village behind. The path turned steeper as they approached the low hills that marked the edge of the old borderlands. Harrow's Rest, if it still existed, would lie just beyond them, a place once caught between territories, now forgotten by lords and maps alike. The journey took 2 days. The second morning dawned with mist draped across the high meadows and frost clinging to the saddle leather. They passed through a stretch of woodland where the trees bent close over the road, their limbs creaking like old bones in the wind. In the distance, a stream murmured between stones, and somewhere nearby, the sharp cry of a hawk echoed overhead. Then, in the early light of the third day, they saw it. A scattering of homes nestled in a hollow, smoke curling gently from a few chimneys. There was no wall, no gate, just a wide path that curved between houses, past a central green where goats wandered without rope or collar. Children ran barefoot, their laughter thin in the morning air. A woman passed them with a basket of herbs, nodded, and kept walking. It was Thomas who saw the forge first. At the edge of the hollow, near a bend in the stream, stood a simple building of stone and timber with a long sloped roof and open walls on 2 sides. The fire within was steady. Tools hung neatly from pegs, and a rack of horseshoes gleamed in the light. A man stood at the anvil, back turned, shoulders wide beneath a leather apron. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, tied back with a strip of cloth. He worked slowly, rhythmically, hammer rising, falling, metal ringing. Alaric dismounted. He walked toward the forge with quiet steps, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. The man looked up. His face was weathered, lined deeply at the corners of the eyes, his brow furrowed. For a moment, recognition flickered, then something deeper. Alaric, he said. Raiden. They stood in the forge's threshold, neither moving, the fire crackling between them. It's been years, Raiden said. A lifetime, Alaric replied. The blacksmith set down his hammer and pulled the gloves from his hands. He stepped forward and looked the knight up and down, not to measure strength, but to see what remained. I heard your name again recently, he said. Thought it was a rumor. It was, Alaric said, for a long time. Raiden looked at the boy now standing quietly behind him. You've taken a squire. I've found someone worth teaching. Raiden's gaze softened, just slightly. Then perhaps you finally learned something yourself. Alaric gave a short, tired laugh. I came, he said, not to ask for anything, only to see if what you left for was real. Redan turned toward the forge and lifted a length of iron from the coals. He laid it gently on the anvil. Sparks hissed. He gestured to a bench near the wall. Then sit, he said, and stay a while. And in that invitation, not grand, not ceremonial, but given with the ease of someone who knew the cost of silence, a new chapter began. Not of atonement, not of answers, but of presence. And that, for now, was enough. The days in Harrow's Rest were slow, not with idleness, but with intent. There was no bell to divide the hours, no summons or scrolls, no banners raised or messages sent across the hills. The people worked in rhythm shaped by the sun and the soil. They rose with the light, labored through the warmth, and set down their burdens when the shadows grew long. There were no guards, no taxes, no masters, just the steady weaving of quiet lives now stitched together by need and neighborly respect. Alaric and Thomas stayed in a modest room above the village's communal hall, offered freely by the steward, an elderly woman named Marin, who'd once taught reading to half the children in the valley and still kept her garden in neat, symmetrical rows. She asked few questions, but her eyes were sharp. She seemed to see more than Alaric ever said. The forge became their center. Each morning, Alaric would rise early, plus long before the village stirred, and walk the short path to the blacksmith's. There, Redan would already be at work, the coals glowing orange beneath the breath of the bellows, the iron tools laid out like instruments of a simpler faith. They didn't speak much, not at first. Redan worked with the deliberation of a man who had once lived by seconds and now lived by seasons. His hands were thick with callus, but graceful. He didn't just shape iron, he guided it, listening to it in the hiss of steam, the echo of each strike. Alaric watched, then offered his own hands when needed, holding, turning, lifting. He wasn't trained as a smith, but the discipline of the blade translated. He knew how to move with weight. He understood heat and patience. He understood, more than anything, the silence of focused labor. Thomas, meanwhile, made himself useful around the village. He helped mend fences, carried buckets from the stream, and spent hours with a retired mason learning how to mix mortar for a small stone wall that bordered the south field. The boy's hands blistered, then hardened. His back ached, then strengthened. He never complained. One evening, after the forge was cleaned and the fire banked, Redan and Alaric sat on a bench outside, mugs of weak ale in their hands. The wind had turned warm that day, and the sky was a deep cobalt, streaked with the last blush of sunset. "I thought I'd never see you again," Redan said. "I thought I was finished," Alaric replied. Redan nodded slowly. "And are you?" Alaric took a long sip. "I don't think we ever are," he said. "Not really, but the war inside me, it's quieter now." They sat without words for a time, listening to the crickets tuning their evening song. "You know," Redan said eventually, "I left because I couldn't tell if I was still fighting for something, or just fighting to keep myself from being forgotten." Alaric looked toward the hills, dark against the fading sky, and did this. He gestured lightly at the village. "Fill the space?" "No," Redan said, "but it gave me something new to protect. That was enough." He set down his mug and stood. "Come," he said. He led Alaric up a narrow path that twisted behind the forge, through a thin veil of trees. At the top of the rise, the world opened again. Below them, the village glowed with the soft light of hearths and lanterns. Smoke curled lazily from rooftops. A dog barked once, then quieted. Beyond the fields, the land fell away into layered folds of shadowed hills. Redan pointed to a simple stone marker, half sunken near the edge of the overlook. It bore no name, just a sigil, a circle broken by a single line. "A friend," he said. "She came here after fleeing the marches. Her family lost in the sieges. We never spoke of what she left behind, only what she grew." Alaric nodded. He didn't ask more. Redan continued. "When she died, I carved that myself. I didn't want her remembered for the things she escaped, only for the fact that she stayed." The wind stirred the grass around their boots. "I didn't stay," Alaric said. "But you returned," Redan replied. They walked back down in silence. That night, Alaric lay awake beneath a thatched roof, listening to the creak of timbers and the slow breathing of the boy who had followed him farther than most would. He thought of the roads behind them, of Calvain, of Marquette, of the faces of men now long buried, their names sealed in record or forgotten entirely. And he thought of the forge, of fire that built instead of destroyed, of hammers that rang not in rage but in rhythm. In the space between those thoughts, something inside him shifted. Not a revelation, not a sudden clarity, but a soft and steady change. The sword, still wrapped in linen beneath his bed, felt more distant now. Not discarded, but understood. And perhaps for the first time in a life drawn by the point of steel, he began to imagine what it meant to lay it down, not in shame, but in peace. The leaves began to fall on the 12th morning. Not in flurries, not in storms, just in quiet pairs, drifting from the trees with the gentleness of a breath released at last. They tumbled across the rooftops of Harrow's Rest, collected in the corners of fences and along the edges of wells. Their colors were fire and earth, amber, rust, pale gold, and they carried with them the quiet rhythm of change. Alaric noticed it while sweeping the path behind the forge. A single leaf settled on his shoulder. He paused, picked it off with a gloved hand, and turned it in the light. A small, perfect thing, whole despite its journey from the branch. Redan stepped out of the forge behind him, arms streaked with soot. "Season's turning," he said, wiping his hands. "Soon the valley will go quiet." "It already feels quieter than most places I've known," Alaric replied. "It does that." They worked together without further words, stacking wood for the colder weeks ahead, checking the roofline for leaks, oiling the hinges on the heavy doors that would soon need to stay closed against wind. The forge was never still for long. Even when not shaping metal, it demanded care, like a companion that spoke not in language but in warmth and smoke. Thomas spent most of that day in the eastern fields, helping the villagers with the harvest. He returned in the late afternoon, boots muddy, sleeves rolled, hands stained from the apples they had collected and sorted into wooden crates. His face carried a glow that no sword had ever put there. He dropped the basket by the door, dusted his hands, and approached Alaric as the night wiped down the handles of the wheelbarrow. "I was asked to stay." Alaric glanced at him. "By whom?" "The steward, Marin, said I had a good sense for the land, and the children liked me." "And what did you say?" Thomas hesitated. "I said I didn't know, that I needed to ask you." Alaric straightened, resting both hands on the rim of the barrow. He looked at the boy carefully. "Why?" "Because I thought." Thomas looked down. "I thought maybe I was still your squire." "You are," Alaric said. Thomas looked up. "But the question is," Alaric continued, "what are you still trying to learn?" The wind shifted slightly. A few leaves skipped across the ground. Thomas didn't answer at once. He looked over his shoulder, toward the field, toward the children still laughing as they carried baskets, toward the smoke rising from the kitchen hearths. "I want to know what it means to build something, with my hands, with time, not just to protect it, but to make it." Alaric nodded slowly. "Then you've outgrown the path you came on." Thomas's eyes searched his face. "You're not angry?" "No," Alaric said, voice calm. "I was meant to bring you this far. That was always enough." Thomas swallowed. "Will you stay too?" Alaric didn't answer. Not yet. That evening, after the last meal and the sun had fallen behind the hills in a blaze of orange and plum, Alaric returned to the forge. Redan was still there, sitting on a low stool near the banked coals, oiling a pair of tongs. The fire was low, casting long shadows that moved as gently as breath. Alaric entered, removed his cloak, and sat across from him. "Thomas may stay," he said. Redan nodded. "I wondered." "He's asking the right questions, the kind that don't start with steel." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creaking of the timbers above, the soft pop of cooling iron. Van reached into a crate beside him and pulled out a folded piece of canvas. He laid it across his knees and unwrapped it. Inside was a longsword. It was not ornate, no gilding, no etchings, just clean steel, well forged, with a grip wrapped in dark leather and a crossguard simple but sturdy. It looked new, unused, but heavy with meaning. "I made this when I first settled here," Redan said. "Not for sale, not for show, for memory." He offered it across the coals. Alaric looked at it. "Not to carry," Redan said, "but to leave behind." Alaric took it. His hands closed around the grip. Familiar, so familiar. He held it for a long moment, then stood and walked to the workbench. There, he placed the blade flat across the wood, beneath a rack of pliers and a lantern guttering in the dark. And he stepped away. The two men sat once more. Outside, the stars began to emerge. Later that night, Alaric returned to his room, washed the soot from his hands, and sat at the small desk beside the shuttered window. He opened his pack. From it, he drew out the last piece of armor he had carried, his gorget, the collar that had once protected his throat in battle. He held it in his lap, turned it over. The inside still bore the faint imprint of his skin, the wear of years. He set it gently on the floor beside his bed. Then at last he lay down. And when sleep came, it was not as a retreat. It was not the exhaustion of survival. It was rest, deep, undisturbed, and earned. The frost came quietly. One morning, before the village stirred, a thin silver crust lay over every surface, the tops of fences, the bell of the chapel, the wooden rail along the forge. Even the forge's coals, long since cooled from the night before, seemed to wear a glaze of ice, waiting to be stirred into warmth again. Alaric stood in the doorway, cloak pulled around his shoulders, watching his breath rise in slow clouds. The valley below was hushed, the fields pale, the river sluggish and whispering as it passed through reeds browned by the season's turn. Behind him, the forge was still. The anvil slept. The hammer rested. It had been 3 weeks since their arrival in Harrow's Rest. Thomas was already gone to the orchard, a basket in hand, the final apples of the season still waiting to be taken down. He had begun to wake earlier, often without prompting, his movements practiced, his questions fewer. The boy had grown, subtly, not in height, but in presence. He no longer watched the world like someone awaiting instruction. He watched it like someone who had decided to stay. And Alaric, he no longer waited either. That morning he walked beyond the village, up the path that wound past the old chapel and into the low hills that framed the valley's eastern edge. He carried nothing, no sword, no armor, no cloak heavy with symbol, only his hands, folded behind his back, and his thoughts. The climb was gentle, the way worn smooth by generations of boots and hooves. At the crest, a flat outcropping of stone overlooked the entire valley. Harrow's Rest stretched beneath him like a painting done in soft earth tones and faded smoke. The fields, the orchard, the stream that curved like a silver ribbon, the thatched roofs darkened with morning frost. He stood there for a long time, and then slowly he knelt. It was not ritual, not prayer, just presence. A kind of surrender, not to a god, but to the moment itself. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he let his memory settle not on regret or loss, but on the quiet spaces between. The laughter that had followed him down certain roads, the glint of morning on a blade before the first clash, the sound of Thomas reading aloud from a book he barely understood, the scrape of steel against whetstone, the silence that followed a duel when no words could or should be spoken. And most of all, the faces, not the ones he'd buried, but the ones he'd let go. Radon, Emeric, even Céline Marquet. People who had entered his life like sparks struck from stone, sudden, sharp, illuminating. He stayed there until the sun rose fully above the far ridge, flooding the valley with pale gold. Then he stood, turned, and walked back down. By midday, he was in the forge once more, helping Radon fit new iron hinges for a barn door damaged by the last storm. They worked with ease, their movements aligned by habit and mutual understanding. Neither spoke of the past, neither needed to. That evening, the village gathered for the first fire of the cold season. It was a tradition, they said, an old one. No feast, no ceremony, just a blaze built in the central green where the oldest tree stood, its branches bare now silhouetted against the darkening sky. Children brought branches. Elders lit candles and placed them in the hollows of gourds. Songs were sung, not grand songs, not the kind with verses about kings and wars, but simple ones, about bread, about rivers, about home. Alaric stood at the edge of the circle, his cloak drawn close, Thomas beside him. The boy watched the fire with wide eyes. Its reflection danced in his pupils. His hands were dirty, his boots scuffed, his tunic patched in 3 places, but his face was at peace. "Will you leave?" Thomas asked softly. Alaric looked at the fire a moment longer, then turned. "No," he said, "I won't." Thomas nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. They stood in silence, and the fire roared higher, sparks rising into the stars. Later that night, back in their room above the hall, Alaric removed the last of the linen-wrapped bundle from beneath his bed. The sword, the one that had followed him through so many years, so many reckonings, lay across his lap. He stared at it. Then, with slow fingers, he began to unwrap the grip, strip by strip. The leather loosened. The layers beneath softened and frayed. The steel was clean but worn, a life etched in its edge. He laid it in a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, beside the gorget, beside the last remnants of the knight he had once been. Then he closed the lid and latched it. He didn't lock it. He didn't bury it. He simply stepped away. Outside, the wind had calmed. The frost glinted faintly on the rooftops. And beneath the stars, in a village far from courts and fields of battle, a man who had once carried the weight of a sword now carried only his name. Alaric of Montrois, uncondemned, unburdened, and at last home.